What if those giant footprints, those excavated skeletons, standing more than 7 feet tall, were evidence of the existence of the Nephilim giants in the Bible? What if the colossal sea monster Kraken that drowned sailors was not an illusion, but a real deep-sea creature with eyes as large as basketballs, known for leaving enormous scars on the bodies of sperm whales? And what if the scream that spread death across the battlefield did not come from the underworld, but was a sound weapon produced by hundreds of Aztec death whistles designed to shatter the minds of their enemies before the swords were raised? For centuries, scholars and historians used only one word to summarize all of these phenomena: myth. They were convinced that the great legends were in reality only fears and oral tales created by ancient people to explain events beyond their control. But sometimes the most fantastical and unbelievable part of a legend is actually the raw truth that not everyone is clear-minded enough to recognize. Recently, archaeologists peeled back with their own hands 9 layers of ruins soaked in ash from the great city of Troy, directly excavated giant skeletons buried deep beneath the sands of Jordan, and blew into a whistle cast in the shape of a skull to hear again the icy shriek of death. Or deep beneath the Mediterranean Sea, where divers used steel pulley systems to raise colossal statues of gods weighing tens of tons from the city of Heracleon, proving the real existence of one of the busiest harbor cities in the ancient Egyptian world. All of these discoveries created a global shockwave. They forced many people to ask, in the end, what is legend and what is truly real? Welcome to 15 Legends of Ancient Gods and Giants. Archaeologists finally confirmed. Tonight we will take up the torch with our own hands, overturn the layers of desert sand, and directly touch physical ruins more brutal, more magnificent, and more astonishing than any myth humanity has ever passed down. Chapter 1: Giant Bones and Deep Sea Monsters. To begin tonight's journey, we will step away from the dry sands of the land and let ourselves slowly sink into the freezing waters of the ocean. At the bottom of that abyss, thick with darkness, history is hiding enormous biological masses of flesh and bone. Legend number 1. The Kraken sea monster and the battle at the bottom of the abyss. In the midst of the mist-covered ocean, the eyes of northern sailors suddenly caught sight of a gigantic mass of flesh rising above the surface of the water. Its rough and enormous surface looked exactly like a newly formed island. That presence deceived the vision of even the most seasoned men of the sea. Believing they had just found a peaceful place to rest, they shouted with joy and together dropped their heavy iron anchors, driving them deep into that strange surface. Groups of men eagerly climbed straight onto the dark mound, hurriedly stretching ropes, raising canvas shelters, and piling dry wood to start a warming fire. The moment the embers began to catch on the wet branches, the slimy surface beneath their feet suddenly trembled violently. The entire island thrashed with force, throwing tents and men into the air. From the abyss below, enormous tentacles rose up and wrapped tightly around the main mast, twisting the oak hull of the ship into thousands of splintered planks, reeking of the sea. The colossal monster dragged the entire crew from its back, pulling them straight down into the black and freezing depths of the ocean. Those standing on the ships behind could only stare at the tragedy unfolding, carrying that overwhelming fear and that truth back to land. For centuries, historians placed the story of the Kraken among folk legends. They regarded it as the result of hallucinations from drunken sailors lost in the loneliness of the open sea. All doubt immediately came to a halt when the sperm whale hunting industry rose in the 19th century. When hunters used iron winches to haul the bodies of giant whales onto the deck, they saw with their own eyes extremely brutal wounds. Covering the whale's thick layer of blubber were countless circular scars carved deep into the flesh. These scars were as large as dinner plates, with sharp, serrated edges matching perfectly with the suction cups of a mollusk. They were the rawest evidence of a bloody battle taking place thousands of meters deep, where water pressure crushes almost every other form of life. Biologists quickly entered the investigation. They cut open the stomachs of sperm whales and pulled out tens of thousands of horn-like beaks, as hard as steel. These sharp beaks had the exact shape of parrot beaks, but were as large as a person's embrace. Then, intact bodies of giant squid began washing onto the beaches of Newfoundland. Scientists brought their toolboxes to the scene, pulled out measuring tapes, and officially confirmed that these slimy tentacles reached 45 feet in length, equal to nearly 14 meters. The dissection process brought an even more chilling discovery. Researchers used scalpels to separate the monster's head and pulled out its enormous eyes, each as large as a basketball. This gigantic visual structure exists to absorb even the faintest particles of light. Those eyes allow them to see through the thick darkness of the ocean abyss, patiently waiting and precisely locating prey swimming past. Even today, the camera lenses of deep-diving submarines continue to record the appearance of living giant squid. Our entire understanding of the maximum size of the Kraken is based mainly on measuring the brutal wounds they leave on the bodies of sperm whales, the rare predators that manage to survive and rise back to the surface after the death struggle. The old northern sailors recorded the truth with their own flesh and blood. They directly faced a colossal creature of nature out on the dark Atlantic. The story of the Kraken carries absolute accuracy. The unlucky sailors who climbed onto the back of that island remained forever at the bottom of the deep abyss, leaving only those watching from a safe distance to return and tell the true nature of what happened. Leaving the freezing seabed behind, we return to the dry surface of the earth to overturn an even older mystery. This time, what the archaeological shovels dig up is not slimy tentacles, but flesh and bone skeletons, standing as towering evidence of a mighty race that once walked through the Bible. Legend number 2, the giant Nephilim skeletons and the answer from archaeology. There is one undeniable truth all over the world, from the sheepskin scrolls recording the Nephilim in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 6 verse 4, to Greek murals depicting the Titans, to Norse rune-carved texts telling of giants with enormous stature and overwhelming strength. In the Bible, the Nephilim appear as a frightening sign of the age before the Great Flood. Genesis tells of a distant era in which the transmitted stories are stained with unease, as if humanity were slowly walking into its own darkness, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men, giving birth to figures called the heroes of old men of renown. The sentence is short, but its weight has stretched across thousands of years. It opens a great door in religious imagination. Before the flood did the earth once hold races or beings that exceeded the normal limits of humanity. The Book of Enoch later deepened that obsession through the image of the fallen watchers. Those rebellious angels descended to the earth, joined themselves to human women, and produced a violent race of giants. In Enoch's telling, the Nephilim are seen as the result of angels crossing the boundary God had established. They carried great strength, great greed, a great hunger, and then turned the earth into a place filled with cries of anguish. That story has always carried a warning: when sacred power is abused, the human world pays the price in blood, fear, and judgment. In ancient Greece, the image of giants appeared in a different color. The Titans were the primordial generation of divine beings, the children of Uranus and Gaia, heaven and earth. They belonged to a very ancient age before Zeus and the Olympian gods took power. In those stories, the Titans represented primal strength, prehistoric power, and an old order replaced after a war between generations of gods. The Greeks looked at the world through high mountains, vast seas, earthquakes, storms, and lands full of fossils. From there, they told of giant races that once fought against the gods, were buried beneath mountains, and became the memory of an age long gone. In the frozen north, where winter could last for months and the ground was covered in snow and ice, The Norse preserved the image of the Jotun in stories passed down orally through many generations. The epics and myths about Ymir Jotunheim, Thor, Odin, and Ragnarok were not merely entertaining tales beside the fire, but reflected the way the Norse viewed the harsh natural world around them. Jotun is often translated as giant, but that understanding reflects only a very small part of their nature. In ancient texts, such as the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, the Jotun are not simply creatures with enormous bodies. They are ancient beings that existed from the beginning of the universe, even before the world of human beings was formed. According to Norse mythology, Ymir, the ancestor of the Jotun, appeared from the primordial void of Ginnungagap, where the frost from the north met the heat from the south. From Ymir's body, generations of Jotun were born, and later Odin and his brothers killed Ymir to create the world. His flesh became the earth, his blood became the sea, his bones became the mountains, and his skull became the sky. This shows that the Norse did not see the Jotun merely as enemies of the gods. They were part of the very structure of the cosmos. Many Aesir gods had blood ties with the Jotun. Odin was a descendant of this race through his mother. Thor, the thunder god, famous for his hammer, Mjolnir spent much of his time fighting the Jotun. Yet many stories also show the complicated bond between the two sides through marriage alliances or blood relationships. In the imagination of the Norse, the Jotun often lived in Jotunheim, a land beyond the world of human beings and gods. It was a place of dangerous mountain ranges, ice-covered valleys, dark forests, and violent seas. They were described in many different forms. Some were as gigantic as mountains of stone, some possessed deep wisdom, some held ancient magic, and some female Jotun were famous for beauty or wisdom. For that reason, the Jotun represented forces the Norse both feared and had to face: everyday snowstorms, raging seas, harsh winters, dangerous mountains, and the chaos always waiting beyond the boundaries of order. They were the embodiment of wild nature, not yet tamed. In many stories, the gods had to continually struggle against the Jotun to maintain the order of the world, but could never completely remove them. Even at Ragnarok, the final battle of Norse mythology, the Jotun still play a central role. They will march with the forces of chaos into the last war against the Aesir gods. This reflects a very distinct belief of the Norse chaos. Never disappears completely. It always exists at the edge of the world and will eventually return. Therefore, in the Norse worldview, giants are not merely large and frightening creatures. They are the memory of the primordial age of the universe, symbols of ancient powers beyond human control, where life, destruction, and destiny are always intertwined. What is remarkable lies in the repetition of the same memory across many civilizations. The Hebrews spoke of the Nephilim, the Greeks told of the Titans and the Gigantes. The Norse remembered the Jotun. Many other cultures also carry similar stories. People too, large ancient tribes, too powerful, half human and half divine beings. Warriors who once ruled the earth before the present age began. For many centuries, scholars usually frame these stories in psychological and symbolic terms. And so, for centuries, books have stuffed into our minds the idea that giants were only products of imagination. They called them symbols of natural disasters, exaggerations of hostile tribes, nothing more than mythological poetry. They deliberately buried the truth inside safe definitions. But the raw truth has now been exposed under the sunlight when archaeological shovels struck directly into flesh and bone skeletons of giants. From 2005 until now, in the Tal El Hammam region of Jordan, archaeologists have patiently peeled back layer after layer of clay dust. The archaeologists carried out direct measurements right at the site the very moment the skeleton emerged from the earth. At the Tal El Hammam region in Jordan, after many days of carefully brushing away layers of clay dust clinging tightly to the remains, the research team finally exposed the entire skeleton of an ancient individual. When the steel measuring tape was placed against the femur, the results showed that this person's actual stature reached 2.3 meters. The bone fragments were not only long, but also possessed extremely dense mineral content, proving a body frame capable of bearing tremendous weight. On the island of Sardinia in Italy, excavations took place inside caves sunk deep beneath the earth. Geological exploration teams had to use pulley systems to bring equipment into the limestone cavities. There they pulled out skulls twice the size of an ordinary human skull. From the pelvic frames and vertebrae, buried beneath layers of stalactite, experts reconstructed and estimated that this individual's height reached 2.5 meters. This was not speculation on paper, but the result of fitting each broken bone fragment together under the floodlights of the work site. The evidence does not stop with modern discoveries. History has recorded the presence of these people for a very long time. As early as the 17th century, Sir Walter Raleigh, an erudite scholar, carried out a massive synthesis in his book, History of the World. He did not simply sit still in a library, but worked carefully to compare the maritime journals of earlier explorers. In the opening chapters of the book, Raleigh described in detail the appearance, locations, and stature of the giants that ship crews had encountered in distant lands at that time. He recorded them carefully, turning the accounts of earlier travelers into authenticated lines of documentation, laying a foundation for reconsidering the actual stature of ancient inhabitants compared with the standards of modern human beings. The power of these giant individuals is not shown only in skeletons dug up from layers of clay dust, but also appears directly through stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons objects that modern human beings still struggle to lift, even with dozens of steel cranes. On the Giza Plateau in Egypt, the limestone and granite blocks that make up the pyramids weigh from 2.5 tons to 80 tons each. Under the blazing sun, these stone blocks were stacked upon one another to heights of hundreds of meters with absolute precision in their joints. These slabs could not be moved by ordinary human strength. With the stature of the individuals standing over 2 meters tall that we have just excavated, they possessed superior bodily leverage and muscle density, fully capable of carrying out lifting and placement operations that every effort of modern human beings must depend on industrial machinery to perform. The peak of structures that challenge every limit is the temple complex at Baalbek in Lebanon. The researchers have had to bow before the Trilithan stones, weighing up to 800 tons stacked at a height of 20 meters above the ground. Each of these stones weighs as much as hundreds of full-grown elephants combined. No pulley or wheel system known to us could withstand the pressure of such a load. These gigantic stones remain there, like a forceful declaration of the ability of a race that once ruled the earth, individuals of overwhelming stature and power, who laid the foundation for structures that have endured through time. All the evidence from bones to the stone blocks at Giza or Baalbek has completely removed the metaphorical cloak that historians once placed over the stories of giants. Our ancestors were not telling fairy tales. They directly faced them, saw them with their own eyes, and recorded the presence of individuals with abnormal stature. They were true builders engineers who once walked across this earth with heavy steps, leaving behind stone block legacies that even in the age of technology, we still cannot fully understand how they completed. And beyond stone structures, the earth also preserves direct traces from their very footsteps. In the town of Impuluzi, South Africa, a footprint 1.2 meters long is imprinted deeply into rough granite. The stone grains on the surface of the footprint share the same structure as the surrounding rock, proving a process of immense pressure compressed onto a soft stone surface millions of years ago. Natural erosion could not create such perfectly symmetrical lines, exactly like a human foot. After surveying the site, mathematician Peter Wagener frankly confirmed that the probability of erosion creating this shape was lower than the appearance of a space entity at the location. In a valley of southern Ecuador, the family of priest Carlos Vaca found enormous bone remains buried deep in the earth. When anthropologists received these heel bone and occipital bone fragments, they compared them and confirmed that they belonged to an individual whose height reached 7.6 meters. These bone fragments had survived for millennia, carrying the mineral density of a living entity that once moved across this planet. Their traces are not found only in South Africa or Ecuador, but stretch across the continents. In Turkey, archaeologists excavated femurs as long as 120 centimeters. With standard body proportions, this individual would have stood 5 meters tall. In the state of Kansas, in the United States, giant footprints were recorded, showing that the stature of the being who made them reached 7.6 meters. Even at the Ain Dara temple in Syria, carved into the hard stone floor, are pairs of footprints 1 meter long, spaced about 9 meters apart with each stride. These stone blocks are evidence of an entity up to 20 meters tall that once stepped through the corridor of the temple. The peak of these discoveries is a 38-centimeter-long finger relic recorded by a Swiss businessman in Egypt. Close-up photographs clearly show the nail structure and torn skin layer, accompanied by X-ray film confirming the bone structure of a human finger. It was not a fabricated model, but part of a mummified body. After all this, what remains is not merely bones or stone blocks, but an undeniable truth. Human beings were not the only entities that once ruled this planet. Femurs, 120 centimeters long, and footprints imprinted deep into granite are the final confirmation of the real existence of giant beings who once lived and left their footprints across our globe thousands of years ago. Or, what we call legend or myth may in truth be only the surviving fragments of memory from a glorious age buried by time. And when we look at those giant footprints, we do not only see the past, we also see a quiet reminder of the limits of our own civilization today. The greatness of the past did not stop with human-like forms. As we leave the desert stones and move deeper into the red earth mountain slopes of the east, the ground continues to reveal other gigantic skeletons. Only thousands of years ago, when farmers swung their hoes, broke open mountain walls and pulled out thigh bones as large as tree trunks, they did not think of Nephilim or Titans. They were certain they had just found the remains of dragons. Legend number 3. Dragon bones in Chinese medicine and the mysterious existence of dragons. When dragons are mentioned, many Westerners immediately think of the giant red dragon in the Book of Revelation, with 7 heads and 10 horns, carrying an atmosphere of judgment and terror. In the vision of the Apostle John, that dragon represents power opposed to God, a fierce symbol of Satan and the dark forces that always seek to devour what is holy. For that reason, in the Western imagination, dragons often appear as creatures of fire, the abyss, war, and destruction. But on the other side of the hemisphere, the Eastern dragon carries an almost opposite meaning. In the ancient writings, paintings, sculptures, legends, and rituals of China, the dragon is honored as a noble spiritual creature. Its form blends many powerful features: hard fish scales, a long body coiling like a serpent, a thick lion-like mane, sharp claws, tall deer antlers, and bright eyes that seem to see through clouds and mist. That massive body flies through the layers of cloud, by its own power cutting through the wind across the sky, coiling its body in thunder and lightning, and pulling rain down to the earth. In the traditional Chinese zodiac, there are 12 animals representing the years in the cycle of time. Most of them are familiar animals, such as the rat, ox, tiger, rabbit, snake, horse, goat, monkey, rooster, dog, and pig. But there is one special exception: the dragon. It is the only mythical creature that appears among real animals. That very fact makes the dragon different. The fact that the dragon is placed on the same level as familiar animals in daily life has caused many people throughout the ages to see it as a sign that dragons were not entirely products of imagination. To them, the dragon's presence among the 12 zodiac animals was like an acknowledgement that this creature had once existed, or at least had originated from some real being in the past. Eastern people regarded the dragon as a sacred creature that brought favorable rain harmony and life to all things. The dragon called down heavy rain to water the fields. The dragon awakened green shoots after days of dry earth. The dragon lifted rivers, regulated clouds and winds, protected harvests, and nourished all living things. Even from ancient times, the image of the dragon stood at the height of nobility. The Chinese emperor used the dragon as a symbol of the mandate of heaven and supreme authority. Dragon robes, dragon beds, dragon countenance, dragon veins, dragon palaces, both courtly and folk language, place the dragon close to heaven, to the king, to reign to the earth, and to the destiny of the nation. For that reason, people built temples, performed rain-praying rituals, carved dragons onto stone pillars, embroidered dragons on robes, painted dragons on ceramic vessels, placed dragons on palace roofs, and called upon the name of the dragon in moments when they needed the protection of heaven and earth. The reverence for dragons did not appear only in temples or legends. It also entered the everyday life of human beings. People even believed that part of the dragon's power could be absorbed through traditional remedies. For thousands of years, deep inside medicine shops, thick with the smell of herbs, among old wooden drawers, cutting blades, stone mortars, and prescriptions wrapped in yellow paper, traditional healers preserved a precious medicinal material called longu. Longu means dragon bone. So where did they find dragons in order to obtain dragon bones? According to the records of historians from a very early time, the Chinese passed down stories about strange bones dug up from the earth. They did not resemble the bones of any familiar animal. Some bone fragments were unusually long, heavy as stone. There were gigantic vertebrae, fossilized jaw sections, and skull fragments mineralized by time. When people dug fields, opened land, or cut roads along hillsides, they would sometimes encounter these mysterious relics lying deep beneath ancient layers of sediment. No one knew what creature they belonged to. No one had any concept of dinosaurs or paleontology. But they knew one thing: these skeletons were too large to belong to ordinary animals. In the ancient worldview, they were dragons. Therefore, fossils excavated from the earth were called longu, or dragon bones. That name survived for many centuries and gradually became part of traditional Chinese medicine. People collected the fossil blocks, ground them into powder, and used them as a medicine to calm the spirit, suppress convulsions, soothe panic, stabilize the body, and restore vitality. In the understanding of the ancients, the bones of a sacred creature carried the power of heaven and earth, so the remaining bone matter buried in the ground also contained a special kind of vital force. But the story of dragons in Chinese culture does not stop with fossil blocks dug up from the earth. History continues to face another series of forceful pieces of evidence, affirming the flesh and blood presence of this creature even in our own age. What makes many people even more curious are the records and accounts suggesting that dragons seem to have appeared even in modern times. One of the most famous cases mentioned repeatedly in the 20th century took place in the Yingkou region near the Liao River Basin in Liaoning Province. There, in the summer of 1934, rain poured continuously for more than 40 days. The rising waters of the Liao River turned the reed-covered area around it into a marsh. People discovered in the swamp a strange animal whose shape looked very much like the dragon of legend. Witnesses at the time recounted that they saw with their own eyes the dragon, with its eyes wide open, its body white in color, lying coiled on the ground with two legs extending from its belly. In the following days, rain poured down heavily, and the dragon was no longer seen. By August 8, 1934, people discovered an animal skeleton extremely similar to the legendary image of a dragon in Yingkou. According to the description of a farmer at the time, the white skeleton was about 10 meters long. On both sides of the head were legs more than 1 meter long. The spine had a total of 29 vertebrae. The skeleton was later moved to Shihai for display, and countless people came to see it. That event quickly became one of the most famous dragon appearance stories in modern Chinese history. And to this day, it is still repeated as a special piece of evidence in debates about the origin of dragon legends. Even more shocking, a clip was recently posted in England showing a creature that looked like a dragon flying through the air. Although there is not much information about this video, according to what has been found, the man who saw the creature first thought it was a bird or some kind of human-made flying device. However, when he zoomed in on the object, he was completely surprised because no bird has a wingspan that large. And surely, when you witness this scene, you can also guess that it is the image of a dragon flying right. From the great dinosaur fossils rising up beneath the hoe strikes of farmers to the 29 vertebra skeleton at Yingkou, and the footage in the skies above England, traces of this creature always appear in a clear way. Whether they belong to the world of paleontology or to beings still waiting for science to classify them, the existence of dragons is truly very real. The veil covering this creature has been pulled down by the strongest evidence. Leave a comment with the word believe or impossible right below this video to affirm your own view before the raw truths that have just been revealed. Leaving behind the gigantic skeletons of the ancient animal world, we step into another terror that has haunted humanity for thousands of years. This time, death comes from a force that steals life in an instant, turning soft flesh into cold blocks of stone. Legend number 4. Medusa's petrifying gaze and the truth from the stiffened corpses at Lake Natron. Medusa. Just hearing that name is enough for almost everyone to immediately imagine a horrifying face. A woman with a monstrous appearance, eyes as cold as an abyss, the pale skin of a cursed creature, and on her head dozens of slippery venomous snakes, coiling, twisting, flicking their tongues, replacing human hair. She belonged to the line of the Gorgon's female monsters, whose appearance was enough to make even the toughest warrior lose his courage. In the ancient versions, Medusa's 2 sisters, Theno and Euryale, were immortal by nature. Medusa alone could be killed, and that very point led Perseus into one of the most terrifying missions in Greek mythology. Medusa's terrifying power lay in her eyes. Ancient texts say that any living creature that accidentally looked directly into her face would immediately suffer a brutal death. Blood, flesh, tendons, bones, skin, hair, and breath were all stopped in a single instant. The victim stood frozen in place, the face still holding the final expression of terror. And then the entire body hardened into a cold block of stone. That is why Perseus had to use a shield shining like a mirror to look at Medusa through her reflection. He avoided her direct gaze and moved step by step through the lair of the Gorgon among statues shaped like humans and animals that had died in positions of terror. Those petrified bodies were the silent warning to anyone who stepped deeper into Medusa's territory. And yet, despite all that horror, Medusa is now regarded by millions of people with deep sympathy. They believe the story that Medusa was once a woman of stunning beauty, violated by the sea god Poseidon inside a temple, and then forced to bear the unreasonable wrath of the goddess Athena by being transformed into a hideous form. But is that really the truth? Or was Poseidon merely an unwilling victim in the story of Medusa? Let Sleep Codex expose the true nature of the event and affirm that Poseidon and Athena becoming evil gods was only the product of textual reshaping. The most popular version we often hear describes Medusa as a girl of extraordinary beauty. She deeply revered the goddess Athena. Medusa's beauty caught the eye of the sea god Poseidon. Though she refused him, the god still continued pursuing her, and this caused her to run into the temple of the goddess Athena, hoping to be protected. But sadly, the goddess looked away, allowing Medusa to be violated by Poseidon. Some variants instead say that Medusa responded to Poseidon, and the two made love inside the temple of the goddess Athena. Angered by the act that defiled her temple, the goddess Athena punished Medusa instead of Poseidon. Athena turned Medusa into a hideous creature with serpent hair, bronze hands, and sharp claws. From then on, Medusa became a hateful female demon who went around killing men, but absolutely did not threaten women. The tragedy of this story completely reshaped the way modern people see Medusa, creating anger toward the cruel actions of Athena and Poseidon. Yet historical text scholars have shown that both of these Greek gods were burdened with accusations written by a Roman author. When compared with the oldest Greek parchment texts, the truth immediately appears. The foundational text identifying the origins of the gods is Hesiod's Theogony, composed around the 8th century before Christ. In this writing, Medusa's birth is recorded plainly. She was not cursed. She was a monster from the moment she was born. Hesiod's manuscript clearly records this from line 270 to line 280. The two primordial sea deities, Phorcys and Ceto, gave birth to the three Gorgon sisters, including Euryale and Medusa. They lived in the farthest place of darkness. The two sisters possessed immortality, while Medusa alone had a body that could be destroyed. This ancient text confirms that the dark-haired god, Poseidon, lay beside Medusa on a soft meadow among spring flowers. This union happened completely willingly. There was no rape inside a temple, and the goddess Athena was completely absent from Medusa's existence. The original Greek truth existed for many centuries. Everything changed only when the Roman Empire rose and absorbed this culture. In the 1st century, a Roman poet named Ovid took up his pen and wrote the masterpiece, Metamorphoses. Ovid personally reshaped the entire origin of this demon. He erased Medusa's identity as a monster from birth and turned her into a human maiden. He placed Poseidon in the role of a rapist and built Athena into a jealous and cruel goddess in order to create dramatic tension for his work. The intensity and tragedy from Ovid's pen conquered the minds of readers for centuries. This Roman adaptation circulated powerfully through every medium, overwhelming the original truth completely. For that reason, this version of the story became beloved by many people, spread widely across many information channels, and caused a serious misunderstanding that this was the true story of Medusa. However, in reality, it is only an adaptation. The surprising thing is, the petrifying skill of this evil woman may very well have been real. Throughout the 20th century and the early 21st century, many researchers of mythology, archaeology, anthropology, and the history of religion have tried to understand why the image of Medusa has endured so strongly. Most explanations focus on the symbolic meaning of the legend. Some scholars see the story as an image of extreme fear, the mental paralysis that comes when human beings face danger. Others analyze Medusa through the lens of society, gender, or power in ancient Greek culture. Even so, some researchers believe that the inspiration behind the story does not necessarily belong only to the symbolic world, but may have come from real scenes ancient people once witnessed in nature. If ancient people once encountered dead animals whose bodies still kept their shapes stiff and unmoving like stone statues, they very likely tried to explain that phenomenon through the language of myth. For a society without knowledge of chemistry or natural preservation processes, the sight of a living creature becoming a lifeless statue would have been terrifying enough. From there, the idea of a creature able to turn everything into stone with its gaze becomes easier to understand. Instead of arising entirely from imagination, the legend may have been nourished by real observations of extreme environments, places where animal bodies were preserved for long periods and took on the appearance of statues. From this point, the story of Medusa begins to have an interesting connection with a real place on Earth, Lake Natron in Tanzania. At first glance, Lake Natron looks more like a scene from another world than an ordinary lake on Earth. The water is sometimes dark red, sometimes pale pink, and sometimes covered with white patches created by crystallized salt and minerals. The African sky reflects on the surface of the lake, while in the distance stands the volcano Oldoinho Lengai, the mountain of God, in the Maasai language rising firmly in the middle of a hot, dry land. Behind that seemingly peaceful scene is one of the harshest ecosystems on the planet. The water of Lake Natron is highly alkaline, rich in sodium carbonate and mineral salts carried into the lake by hot springs, volcanic ash, and intense evaporation. In the hot and dry conditions, the water slowly recedes. Minerals concentrate, and the lake becomes a gigantic chemical trap for many creatures that wander into it. Well-adapted species can live there. Lesser flamingos, for example, use the very harshness of Lake Natron as a natural fortress for breeding, because many predators avoid those waters. On the other hand, smaller animals that become lost or cannot escape from this mineral-rich water and mud often struggle to survive. Birds, bats, and small animals can die around the lake. When their bodies drift toward the shore, the alkaline water and mineral salts begin their terrifying work. Sodium carbonate, together with the dense mineral environment, soaks their bodies in a way similar to a natural mummification process. Layers of salt and minerals cling tightly to feathers, skin, wings, beaks, and claws, causing the bodies to gradually harden. The result is that many animal corpses look as if they have been turned into statues. A dead bird may still hold its position on a branch. A dead bat may still cling to a tree trunk, its body covered in a gray-white layer of salt and minerals. A small animal corpse lying by the water may keep almost the exact posture it held before death. Seen from a distance, they look like models or statues placed in nature. Life has left them, but the outward form remains for a long time, thanks to the lake's mineral-rich environment. This very phenomenon causes many people to connect Lake Natron with the story of Medusa in Greek mythology. This may also be how ancient people used myth to explain things they did not yet understand about the world around them. The ancients observed nature very carefully. They saw dead animals beside the lake bodies, covered with mineral salts, forms preserved after life had gone out. They understood that the place was dangerous. They knew they needed to stay away from it. They also needed a story strong enough to carry that warning across many generations. In their minds, the world always had regions protected by divine beings and regions occupied by dark powers. A lake that made animals die and then harden like stone certainly belonged to the second group. They would tell one another that a demon lived there, a creature whose gaze could lock flesh and blood in place and turn the body into stone. Medusa, therefore, was both a monster and a warning sign. And whoever heard that story would learn one thing. There are places that look beautiful, but contain death waters, that glitter, but carry poison. That story taught human beings to stay away from toxic waters, deep caves, strange lake shores, places where birds and animals died and their bodies hardened under the sun. Leaving the lake shores with destructive chemical concentrations on land, we raise anchor and send the ship straight out into the vast ocean. The immense surface of the sea continues to create phenomena that deceive human sight. If the demon Medusa was born from the hardening of flesh, then in the middle of the open sea, another legend was formed from the confusion of exhausted sailors collapsing on the deck. History once recorded that the explorer Columbus mistook dugongs holding their young for mermaids. Modern science often uses that mistaken sighting to deny the existence of merpeople, treating them as nothing more than the product of seasick hallucinations on the vast ocean. But the truth is completely the opposite. The anchor of sleep Codex will pull us deep down to the sea floor to open the strongest files about this creature. Legend number 5, the raw existence of the Merfolk. For many years, the screen has carved into the minds of audiences the image of graceful mermaids. They have the face of a perfect human maiden. Their upper bodies possess slender waists and pale white skin. without a single scratch, even though they spend their entire lives immersed in bitterly salty seawater. Their hair is always long and floating brightly colored and carefully groomed. From the hips downward is a long, slender tail covered in layers of shimmering metallic scales. The fin at the end of the tail spreads wide and delicate. That fragile body structure is only a design created to sell tickets. Such a small frame and bare skin would certainly be crushed immediately beneath the enormous pressure and freezing temperature of the deep ocean floor. The truth about mer people is far more raw, forceful, and brutally tied to survival. Geological records confirm that around 23,000 years ago, in the region of the Atlantic Ocean, a special species once ruled the seas, the Merfolk. At that time, our planet possessed an extremely crowded ecosystem. On dry land, ordinary human beings were mastering the continents. They were forging tools, developing science and technology in Europe, and building the towering Maya civilization in North America. Yet while human beings were busy on shore right beneath thousands of meters of deep sea water, the Merfolk tribes had also taken root, multiplied, and built a colossal empire of their own on the ocean floor. In reality, their body structure would overwhelm modern biology. This population carried powerful survival traits and was divided into two species with completely different forms. The first group possessed an upper body built like a human being with 2 arms and a full torso. But from the waist downward, they had a large fishtail covered in strong scales to generate propulsion underwater. The second group had an inverted body form. Their upper bodies carried the features of sea fish, while from the hips downward, they stood firmly on a pair of human legs. This special biological structure helped them adapt perfectly to the harsh environment of the deep sea and create a flesh and blood empire that once existed alongside humanity. They stood up to 2.5 meters tall, equal to the height of smaller Nephilim individuals, with gray-white skin shimmering like moonlight under the waterlight, brown hair, and deep, dark blue eyes. Creation gave them both gills and lungs, allowing them to come ashore and breathe air for 2 to 3 hours. The division of power in their society was extremely clear and reached a weight of 500 kilograms, representing physical strength, while women leaned toward magical function with lifespans exceeding 300 years. They lived together in tribes, used seaweed and algae as food, and organized hunts for whales and small sharks in order to maintain ecological balance under the summoning of the Merking according to the rhythm of the tides. Their spiritual life left shocking marks. The Merfolk worshipped the sea god inside stone palaces, sunk deep beneath the ocean floor tens of thousands of years ago. Those solemn temples preserved spells written in hieroglyphs and stone tablets carved with sacred inscriptions. The light inside the palace shone forever through a special magnesium mineral, activated by magic, creating a blue-white flame that burned brightly within the water for thousands of years. The brilliance of that underwater civilization sprouted upward onto land and directly soaked into the deepest layer of human culture. From the freezing coasts of northern Europe to the sunlit Mediterranean, the oldest legends all honored a single image beings, with the lower half of a flexible fishtail appearing half hidden on the surface of the water. The writer William Thackeray, in the work Vanity Fair, portrayed this image as a symbol of ultimate attraction. The ancient Babylonians worshipped the sea god Poseidon, and especially Erythrian, a being who rose from the ocean to teach humanity the highest knowledge. The Syrians and Felix worshipped mermaids as powerful moon goddesses. The ancient carved mural at the Louvre Museum depicting the sea god Oannes is undeniable physical evidence of a being with a powerful fishtail joined to the upper body of a majestic male figure. In Greece, this creature was called by a haunting name, Siren. They used supernatural singing voices to strip reason away from even the most clear-minded sailors, controlling ships and driving them violently into reefs. Their existence was directly confirmed by the pen of Gaius Plinius Secundus, a respected scholar in the 1st century after Christ. In his masterpiece Natural History, he firmly stated, "As for mermaids, also called Nereids, they truly exist, only their bodies are rough with scales all over." Beyond ancient records, this entity directly collided with human beings through a series of maritime events. The first time merpeople stepped out of the black, deep waters and appeared before mortal eyes was in 1403. On the coast of Holland, a great storm pushed floodwaters high onto the land and then suddenly withdrew far too quickly. That unexpected drop in the tide left one mer person unable to swim back to the ocean, trapping her on the muddy shore. The local people immediately discovered her, surrounded her, and brought the creature directly back to the settlement. The book Speculum Mundi, published in 1635 and written by the English minister John Swan himself, provides a forceful file about this event. The historical text confirms that this sea creature adapted very quickly to life on land. She allowed the people to dress her in coarse cloth clothing, ate cooked food, and freely walked through the streets. This creature even sat and listened to noble women confide in her and learned how to spin thread. Every daily activity took place exactly like that of an ordinary human being. The only difference was that she absolutely never opened her lips to release any sound or language. This creature kept absolute silence beneath the shell of a human life until the day she breathed her last on land. 90 years after the event in Holland, this population of deep-sea beings continued to confront one of the greatest explorers in human history. In 1493, in the waters off the coast of Hispaniola during the voyage toward the region of Rio del Oro, Captain Christopher Columbus saw with his own eyes 3 merpeople rising from the ocean. These 3 gigantic beings used the powerful thrust of their tails to launch their entire bodies high into the air, right in front of the fleet. Columbus immediately took up his pen and recorded the event directly in his maritime journal. The captain wrote clearly the most truthful details in order to shatter every illusion held by Europeans at that time. This group of mer people did not carry the enchanting beauty shown in paintings and sculptures. Their faces were rough, coarse, and strongly masculine in their hard angles. The journal lines of the man who found America have stood firm as powerful historical evidence confirming the raw and brutal form of a species that truly lived beneath the open sea. On June 15, 1608, the explorer Henry Hudson recorded the event in the Bering Sea. One of our company saw a mermaid. She came close to the side of the ship and looked sternly at the men. From the navel upward, she was like a woman. Her body was as large as one of us. Her skin was very white, her hair long and black. When she dived down, her tail was like the tail of a dolphin, speckled like a mackerel. The names of the witnesses were Thomas Hills and Robert Rainey. In 1614, in the freezing waters off Newfoundland, Captain John Smith stood on the deck of his ship and directly faced this creature. The surface of the water parted, revealing the upper body of an individual swimming close to the side of the ship. The captain wrote clearly in his notebook about a creature with large eyes, a straight but slightly short nose, and unusually slender elongated ears. Long, wet green hair clung to her shoulders, giving off a strange attraction. The gaze of a seasoned sailor was completely deceived for a few brief seconds. That fascination was instantly shattered when the creature thrashed her body with force. The clear water revealed that everything below the waist was entirely a fishtail covered in firm scales. In 1619, the level of contact moved one terrifying step further when human beings actually captured this species. The book Adventures in Unhistory preserves a forceful record of the sea voyage of 2 Norwegian senators, Ulf Rosenspara and Christian Hull. While dragging a trawl net, the soldiers on the ship pulled up a mer person violently struggling among the seafood. The 2 high-ranking officials saw with their own eyes a hybrid body lying right on their wooden deck. They observed, compared, and personally touched the scales on the body of that entity. Extreme fear before a life form beyond the limits of nature forced these two powerful men to immediately order it released back into the black abyss of the sea. The collision between the two worlds reached a brutal peak when mainstream newspapers began to enter the matter. In 1738, a major daily newspaper in London published a bloody event that had taken place on the Hebrides Islands. A small mer-person was washed by the waves onto the local beach. When the islanders saw the half-human, half-fish body gasping on the sand, they fell into extreme panic. They were convinced that their sea had just thrown a monstrous omen onto the shore. The entire village gathered, picked up sharp stones, and threw them continuously at the creature until it died completely. The later investigative report confirmed that the entire village, from old to young, was willing to place their hands on the Bible and swear before God to prove that the event in which they themselves killed this creature was 100% true. When the panic passed, they realized they had just taken the life of a strange being. The entire village wrapped the wounded body tightly in a shroud and carefully dug a grave to bury the creature right there on the beach. It was a late act of remorse before the ocean closing one of the rawest flesh and blood pieces of evidence for the existence of mer-people on land. Flesh and blood evidence continued to exist in the form of mummies. At the Enjuin Temple in Okayama Prefecture, Japan, a 30-centimeter mermaid mummy from 1736 is still preserved intact. The mummy possesses a human face with clear teeth, 2 5-fingered hands, and the lower body of a fish. The accompanying letter confirms a mermaid was caught in a net in Kochi province. The fisherman brought it to Osaka to sell. My ancestor bought it and kept it as a family treasure. Halfway around the world, Western intellectuals also made public declarations. On September 8, 1809, the Times of London published a letter from the teacher William Monroe to Dr. Torrance. About 12 years ago, I encountered an image resembling a woman without clothing sitting on a rock out at sea and combing long hair that fell to her shoulders light brown in color. Its head had a rounded forehead and the face was plump. The cheeks were rosy, the eyes blue, the mouth natural. The breasts, stomach, arms, and fingers were of moderate size. It sat there for 3 to 4 minutes combing its thick hair, then plunged into the sea and did not appear again. I can speak one truth only because I saw this phenomenon with my own eyes. Was I completely convinced of the existence of mer-people? Monroe's report was a powerful blow against the skepticism of the scientific world at that time. As time moved into the modern age, the discoveries became even more shocking. On August 24, 1980, the Torch News of Kuwait reported the discovery of a mer-person in the Red Sea, with an upper body resembling a fish and a lower body resembling a human being with 2 long legs and a full set of 10 toes. This detail shattered the fairy tale image of the mermaid and matched perfectly with the second variant of this species. In 1990, the Soviet archaeologist Jeremiah revealed the excavation of a tomb near the Black Sea coast at Sochi. The construction team found a mer-person skeleton measuring 1.73 meters long. Research confirmed that this individual had lived to about 100 years old. The careful burial inside a treasure-filled tomb confirms that they were conscious beings with culture. Decisive fossil evidence appeared on May 21, 1991. The Weekly World Report announced the discovery of a mer-person fossil in limestone along the coast of Yugoslavia near the city of Šibenik. Dr. J. Patrick O'Connor, who directly examined the site, affirmed this creature was female, swam in the ocean about 12,000 years ago and died in an underwater landslide. This 1.6-meter fossil exposed a large head and 2 strong arms, but with sharp claws growing from them, a mouth filled with razor-sharp teeth and eyes without eyelids. This was not a figure from a dream, but a supernatural predator beneath the abyss carrying the bloodline of the fallen Nephilim. All the exploration journals, temple mummies, and million-year fossils affirm a brutal truth. We are not alone. Mer people and giants are the remaining fragments of an age before the Great Flood. The pollution and greed of modern humanity have forced them to dive deeper into the cracks of the sea floor. The truth still remains in the black abyss of the ocean. Leave your comment right below this video to affirm your own view before the forceful evidence that has just been revealed. Legend number 6. King Lycaon and the werewolf phenomenon. When werewolves are mentioned, most modern audiences immediately imagine familiar scenes. From horror films, an ordinary person begins to transform. Under the moonlight, muscles swell, bones and joints crack. The face stretches into a wolf's snout, fangs push outward, and thick fur covers the entire body. After the transformation, the character almost loses the ability to control himself, acts according to predatory instinct, and becomes a threat to anyone who appears in his path. This image has appeared heavily in popular culture for more than a century. From European Gothic novels to classic Hollywood films such as The Wolf Man in 1941, to modern series, the werewolf is often described as a cursed creature that appears only on nights of the full moon and carries within itself the struggle between the human part and the beastly part. Cinema and literature have led many people to believe that the werewolf legend is always tied to moonlight curses and bloody hunts in deep forests. But when we trace the story back to the oldest accounts, the origin of this legend is quite different from the familiar image on today's screen. The ancient root of this myth leads us to a much colder story. It begins in ancient Greece, in the mountainous region of Arcadia, with a king named Lycaon. In Greek mythology, Lycaon was the king of Arcadia, a land of mountains and forests far from the great urban centers, and always associated with a sense of wilderness. The Greeks viewed Arcadia as a place where human beings lived close to nature, close to wild animals, and close to old rituals left over from a very distant age. It was in that land that the story of Lycaon was told as one of the darkest legends. Lycaon was famous for his arrogance. He wanted to test whether Zeus, the supreme god of Olympus, truly knew everything, or whether he was merely a power that could be deceived. When Zeus came down to earth in the form of a guest, Lycaon served at the royal banquet a dish made from human flesh. That was a direct insult to the sacred order. In the ancient world, a banquet prepared for the gods had to be a place of reverence. Lycaon turned it into a place of testing deception and defilement with human blood. His sin lay in daring to use human death to test the power of a god. Zeus immediately recognized the abominable food. In that moment, the atmosphere of the banquet seemed to freeze. The servants fell silent. The guests bowed their heads in fear. According to legend, Zeus needed no explanation. He saw through the entire insult, the arrogance, and the crime lying on the table before him. Then the wrath of the supreme god exploded. Lycaon's palace was struck down. The banquet table was destroyed. The arrogant king received a sentence the Greeks would remember for many generations. He was transformed into a wolf. The important point lies here. To the Greeks, the wolf was tied to forests, mountains, predation, fierce instinct, and life outside the human community. When the story says that Lycaon became a wolf, it is saying something very clear. He lost his humanity through his own crime. A man who used human flesh to insult the divine in the eyes of the ancients had already carried the nature of a wild beast, even before his form changed. That is why Lycaon is often seen as one of the most ancient roots of the Western werewolf myth. His name is also connected with the Greek word lykos, meaning wolf. From that point on, concepts such as lycanthropy, meaning the phenomenon of a human turning into a wolf, continued to develop in European culture. Over many centuries, the story of transformation under moonlight, curses, bites, and half-human, half-wolf monsters was gradually added. But the original core of the legend still lies in something very human. A person can become savage when he crosses the most basic moral boundaries. For many generations, many historians and scholars have read the story of Lycaon as a moral lesson. According to that understanding, it is a warning about arrogance, impiety, and the consequences when human beings dare to challenge the gods. The banquet of human flesh is seen as an extreme image meant to emphasize depravity, while the transformation into a wolf is mythology's way of saying that crime has turned a human being into a beast. This explanation is entirely reasonable, but the excavations on Mount Lycaon have made the story much heavier. Mount Lycaon lies in Arcadia, the very land connected with the legend of Lycaon. This was the place where the ancient Greeks worshipped Zeus. Lycaeus, a title of Zeus closely tied to wolves, mountains, forests, and ancient rituals. On the mountain summit stood a large ash altar where the ancients offered sacrifices for many centuries. Ancient authors such as Pausanias mentioned frightening stories surrounding this mountain. He wrote that at the altar of Zeus, Lycaeus, there was once a tradition connected with sacrifice and transformation into a wolf. Some ancient sources even say that anyone who ate a portion of human flesh in the ritual would turn into a wolf for 9 years and could then return to human form if he avoided human flesh during that time. At first, hearing this detail sounds like a dark legend told as a warning. But when archaeologists climbed Mount Lycaon and began excavating systematically, the story became far more complicated. Modern research at the site has been carried out by Greek and international archaeological teams over many consecutive years. Instead of searching for proof of the legend, they conducted the work according to proper archaeological procedure, measuring the landscape, identifying soil layers, recording the position of each artifact, and analyzing the date of each sediment layer. What drew the attention of researchers was that the altar area on the mountain summit did not resemble an ordinary stone-built temple. It was a massive ash altar formed across centuries from the burning of offerings. When digging down through the accumulated ash layers, archaeologists discovered countless burned animal bones, mostly livestock used in sacrificial rituals. Mixed among them were pottery fragments, votive objects, and many traces showing that this place had been used continuously from a very early period of ancient Greece. That long accumulation is what makes the site especially important. Each layer of ash is like a page of historical record, preserving rituals carried out across many generations. Archaeologists did not find only the trace of one single sacrifice, but evidence of a worship center that existed for centuries. The most shocking discovery appeared during the excavation of an area located directly within the ash altar. Their researchers discovered a human skeleton buried in a position that was quite unusual compared with common burial forms of that period. According to archaeological reports, the skeleton belonged to an adolescent and dated to around 3,000 years ago. What is notable is not only the skeleton itself, but also its location. The remains were found directly within the most sacred ritual zone of the sanctuary of Zeus, Lycaeus. When the discovery was announced, the academic world immediately began debating it. Some researchers argued that this could be the first evidence showing that ancient stories about human sacrifice on Mount Lycaon were not entirely products of imagination. Others were more cautious. They emphasized that finding human remains in a ritual area is not enough to confirm with certainty that a human sacrifice took place. The skeleton must be analyzed in a broader context, including the burial method marks on the bone's dating and its relationship to the surrounding ash layers. That caution is precisely what gives the discovery scientific value. Archaeologists did not declare that they had proven the Lycaon legend to be true. Instead, they pointed out that in the very place ancient Greek writings connected with stories of human sacrifice and a wolf transformation curse, there really did exist human remains lying within an ancient sacrificial area. This is the correct way to understand it. The archaeological discovery has not turned the entire legend into a perfectly accurate report in every detail, but it makes stories once dismissed as completely fantastical far harder to ignore. a place with an altar to Zeus, centuries of sacrificial ash. Countless ritually burned animal bones and human remains, lying within the most sacred area of the sanctuary, clearly had the power to nourish dark legends across many generations. For that reason, Mount Lycaon today is often mentioned as one of the rare places where mythology and archaeology seem to stand very close to each other. Not because archaeology has proven everything the ancients told to be true, but because what has been dug up from the earth shows that behind the legend, there may have existed a reality frightening enough for the ancient Greeks to remember for thousands of years. From here, the story of Lycaon is no longer only a simple moral lesson. It shows that the ancients may have used mythology to speak about a very real fear that rituals once considered sacred could sometimes become brutal, and that human beings could use the name of the divine to do terrifying things. The banquet of human flesh in the legend, therefore, becomes even more frightening. It is not merely a shocking detail in the story. It reflects a very real obsession of ancient society. When human blood appeared on the altar, the order between human beings and the gods had been defiled. What keeps the story of Lycaon remembered to this day is that it is not simply a legend about a man turning into a wolf. At a deeper level, it is a story about a human being losing his humanity. Lycaon was not punished because he resembled a wolf, but because his actions were seen as crossing every moral boundary of human life. What is remarkable is that this legend is tied to a real location. Mount Lycaon is real. The sanctuary of Zeus on it is real. The sacrificial rituals that once took place there are also real. And the discovery of human remains in the altar area makes ancient stories about human sacrifice no longer easy to dismiss as entirely fabricated. Of course, archaeology does not prove that Lycaon once existed or was truly transformed into a wolf. But it does show that legends like this may have grown out of memories or rumors surrounding ancient rituals powerful enough to haunt many generations. Therefore, when the Greeks said that Zeus transformed Lycaon into a wolf, they may not have been telling only a fantasy tale. They were conveying a very clear moral lesson. Human beings must know how to respect the righteous gods and the sacred rules established by the divine. Lycaon did not sin only because of his cruelty, but also because he believed he could deceive and test Zeus. Yet in the world of Greek mythology, no deceitful act can escape the eyes of the gods. That is why the punishment given to Lycaon was so severe. Zeus did not need to investigate or prove anything. He saw the truth immediately and punished the guilty one according to his nature. The message is very clear. Deception may fool human beings, but it cannot fool the divine. And anyone who deliberately insults the sacred order must ultimately bear the consequence. This also creates a connection worth reflecting on for people today. In modern society, many people believe that not believing in divine beings, or even openly mocking and insulting the gods or the Most High, is a sign of progress and freedom of thought. However, what the story of Lycaon wants to emphasize is not whether human beings are allowed to believe or not believe, but their attitude toward what others regard as sacred. For the ancient Greeks, asking questions was normal, but deliberately insulting and challenging the gods merely to display oneself was a dangerous form of arrogance. That is also the core lesson of this legend. In real life, most cultures build morality on the belief that there are limits human beings should not cross. People of faith believe those limits come from the divine, from God, or from a sacred order higher than humanity. Even those who do not follow religion often acknowledge that society needs foundational principles such as respect for life, honesty, justice, and responsibility toward others. The problem usually does not begin with ignorance, but from the moment human beings believe they have the right to stand above those principles. Throughout history, many people, because of power, money, or status, have believed they could do anything they wanted without having to answer for it. At that point, the first thing lost is not reputation or wealth, but the moral foundation that helps human beings distinguish right from wrong. For people of faith, reverence for the divine is not simply fear of being punished. It is the awareness that human beings always have limits and that there are always things greater than themselves. That belief helps many people live more humbly, exercise greater self-control, and consider the moral consequences before acting. In contrast, when human beings believe no limit applies to them, arrogance can very easily lead to decisions that harm others. Therefore, the lasting value of the story does not lie in its mystery or in the image of the werewolf. What is more worthy of reflection is the reminder that strength, knowledge, or status cannot replace morality. A society can only endure when human beings still respect principles higher than their own personal interests. And that is the lesson the myth of Lycaon wanted to pass down. The most dangerous thing is not ignorance, but believing that one is powerful enough to despise every boundary, even sacred ones. Chapter 2. The Bible and the Wrath from Beneath the Earth. Closing the blood-soaked files beneath the ocean floor, we bring our steps back to the dry surface of the earth. The deep ocean conceals hybrid creatures, while the geological layers on land bury the scenes of the most brutal disasters. Modern academia once smiled and treated the extinction events in ancient religious writings as nothing more than moral lessons meant to warn human beings. The shovel of archaeology is pierced through the dust and sand, completely smashing that arrogant judgment. The punishment of the divine was not an empty threat written on parchment scrolls. It was a series of extreme geological disasters that took the lives of tens of thousands of people. The earth truly tore itself open and opened its mouth to swallow the most prosperous civilizations. The first death sentence that Sleep Codex opens tonight does not begin at the collapsed brick walls of Jericho. It is buried deep beneath thousands of tons of sand in the Arabian desert, where one of the most powerful commercial centers of the ancient world was wiped clean from the map in a single night. Legend number 7. The city of Iram, or Ubar, vanished in just one night. Some cities disappear because of war. Some cities slowly die because of drought disease, the decline of trade, or the departure of their people. But the legend of Iram tells of a very different kind of disappearance. An entire wealthy, powerful city, filled with towering pillars, was swallowed down into the earth as if the ground beneath it had suddenly opened its mouth. The Quran records very clearly the existence of a great metropolis named Iram, also known in the Western world as Ubar. This ancient text describes it as a prosperous kingdom that possessed gigantic stone pillars rising high into the sky. Later legends described Iram as an extraordinarily wealthy city located along important trade routes, so rich that later generations called it by names such as the Atlantis of the desert. That name evokes the city's unusual fate. According to legend, the people of Ubar held complete control over the most profitable frankincense trade route of the ancient world. Extreme wealth pushed them deep into an arrogant way of life. The curse of punishment that fell upon them was terribly brutal. The Quran affirms that a wrath from the divine descended upon them directly, burying the entire city beneath the sands of the Rub al-Khali desert in exactly one single night. Western academia once removed the name Ubar from the map of history without hesitation. Scholars were convinced it was only a baseless moral warning tale of the Arabs. No one believed that a great city built of stone blocks could vanish from the surface of the earth so suddenly. The arrogance of historians was completely shattered in 1992. NASA radar satellites sent penetrating waves through the enormous sand dunes. The aerial maps they collected exposed the tangled impressions of ancient trade routes pressed into the desert surface. These routes spread out from many directions, crossed the hot, dry desert, and then converged at one single point in the Shisar region of the Sultanate of Oman. That point immediately drew the attention of researchers. In the middle of a dry desert, merchant caravans never moved without purpose. Thousands of heavily loaded camels would all head toward one single coordinate only if that place guaranteed abundant fresh water resting grounds and a large-scale cargo gathering area. The convergence of this network of deeply sunken trails beneath the sand confirmed that Ubar was the nerve center of the busiest trade route in the ancient world. This city held exclusive control over the frankincense road. At that time, the aromatic resin taken from trees in the southern Arabian Peninsula was one of the most expensive goods in existence. Tons of dried resin were packed into firm bundles loaded onto the backs of camels and gathered entirely at the fortress of Ubar. From this enormous transfer station, caravans continued across the desert to distribute the goods directly into Egypt, the Levant, and the entire Mediterranean world. Ancient rulers and priests consumed large amounts of this aromatic resin in every ritual sacrifice, body embalming, and cleansing of palace air. Its fragrance represented holiness and social status in an absolute way. Control over the frankincense road brought the people of Ubar supreme wealth and regional dominance. This huge flow of riches drove them to build a gigantic stone city inhabited by tens of thousands of people. That reckless development directly drained the groundwater beneath them, hollowed out the foundation, and pulled the entire luxurious city down into a pit of destruction in just one night. These assumptions closely match the rare historical data that still remains. But to be more certain, archaeological teams immediately brought power hammers and sand shovels straight to this coordinate. The pickaxes pierced through the sand and exposed an octagonal fortress system with thick stone walls and towering structures. The city of Ubar was truly there. The digging continued deeper into the foundations of the city and revealed the most horrifying mechanism of this civilization's destruction. And it did not stop there. After gathering all the research files about this mysterious land, historians gradually discovered a fuller picture of the real existence of the city of Iram. It truly was a wealthy city with a special strategic position on the frankincense trade route of the southern Arabian Peninsula. The Shizar site in Oman is often considered a candidate connected with the memory of Ubar or Iram in legend. This place developed by controlling desert wells and the caravans that transported frankincense, one of the most valuable commodities of the ancient world. From around the first millennium before Christ to the early centuries after Christ, this region belonged to a trade network linking southern Arabia with Yemen, the Levant, Egypt, Persia, and the Mediterranean. Merchants passing through this place carried not only goods, but also building techniques, languages, beliefs, and knowledge from many different civilizations. The excavations at Shizar show that this was not a temporary stopover. People found traces of city walls, watchtowers, defensive structures, deep wells, and layers of settlement stretching across many periods. In the harsh environment of the desert, maintaining a stable source of water allowed a relatively developed trade center to form, where caravans could rest, exchange goods, and store supplies before continuing their journey. In terms of belief, there is no archaeological evidence confirming exactly which deity Ubar or Iram worshipped. However, ancient southern Arabian communities of the same period often worshipped many local deities connected with the moon, the sun, the stars, and survival in the desert environment. In ancient kingdoms such as Saba, Hadramaut, and Kataban, gods such as Al-Makka, Athtar, Shams, and Sin were widely honored. Therefore, if Ubar once existed as a trade center within the ancient southern Arabian world, its residents were very likely influenced by a similar polytheistic system of belief. Although there is still not enough strong evidence to make a specific claim, because of its wealth, important trade position, and ability to survive in one of the harshest deserts on Earth, this place entered legend as a magnificent city. But then, a major event changed everything in a very short time. Then, by 1992, the desert of Oman began to give back part of the answer. NASA radar satellites did not merely photograph the edge of the Rub al-Khali, also known as the Empty Quarter, showing ancient root traces lying beneath the sand. They also discovered that this great metropolis had been deliberately built directly above an enormous limestone cave. For tens of thousands of years before that, underground water currents had eroded the limestone, creating a vast subterranean dome structure beneath the desert. This cave held a massive water source functioning as a perfect natural reservoir that supplied all the fresh water for tens of thousands of residents and thousands of camels passing through each day. The boom of the frankincense road caused the city to expand far beyond its limits. The people of Ubar continuously dug their wells deeper. They drew water and drained this underground reservoir at a terrifying speed. The amount of water consumed far exceeded the desert's natural ability to replenish it. The underground lake was emptied down to its bottom. That act of draining the water triggered the machine of destruction. The groundwater had not existed only for drinking. It also created a powerful upward force that directly supported the stone dome above it. When the water disappeared, the entire cave became an empty void. The limestone dome grew dry, brittle, and completely lost its support. Tens of thousands of tons of stone blocks forming the octagonal wall system. The towering structures, the warehouses, and the houses pressed directly down onto a cracked limestone shell. The load-bearing limit broke. The ground at the very center of Ubar split open. The entire foundation collapsed inward, forming a gigantic sinkhole dozens of meters deep. The weight of bricks and stones dragged the entire fortress pillars and thousands of sleeping people straight down into the black abyss. At the very moment the city was swallowed, millions of tons of sand from the enormous surrounding dunes immediately slid down and poured like a funnel into the mouth of the pit. The sand filled every empty space, sealed the entire scene, and wiped every trace of the great city of Ubar clean from the surface of the earth in only one night. Today we call this phenomenon by a simple name, a sinkhole. To ancient people, that scene was almost beyond ordinary explanation. A city stood on the surface of the earth, and then the earth tore open. Stone sand walls and houses slid down into a gigantic darkness. Dust rose. The sound of breaking earth echoed across the desert. The walls that once sheltered caravans suddenly leaned cracked and vanished below. If anyone survived to witness that scene, they would describe it very plainly. The city was swallowed by the earth. It sounds like a story, but in reality it is quite close to what may have happened. At Scythian traces were found showing that the central area had once collapsed into a large pit. The simple explanation is that beneath it was a hollow limestone cave. Over time, the cave roof weakened and then collapsed. When it collapsed, the well was destroyed, and the structures above fell with it. With the loss of water and the loss of a stopping place, the trade route also moved away. The city therefore died. Some sources say this happened in the early centuries after Christ, while others mention around the year 300, but the specific date remains uncertain. What is more important is the mechanism. Ubar, or Scythian, was built on ground with a hollow cave beneath it. Groundwater and limestone created a geological trap. When that trap collapsed, the living center of the settlement collapsed with it. For a desert station, losing the well was almost the same as a death sentence. Caravans would turn in another direction. Merchants would leave. Houses would gradually be swallowed by sand and time. Seen from the outside, a civilization had disappeared. Seen from below, everything happened quietly, almost unnoticed, until it was too late. That is what makes the story of Iram chilling in a very ordinary way. A city can collapse not because of an outside enemy, but because of what lies directly beneath its feet. People still saw tall towers, strong walls, wells, warehouses, and caravans moving back and forth. But no one realized that the emptiness below was growing larger day by day. No amount of wealth can save a foundation that is already weakened from within. Hearing that is enough to understand. A desert city lives by water. If that water source rests above a hollow cave system, the very thing that allows the city to survive can also become the place where disaster opens. People dig wells in order to live. Water moves through limestone to nourish the city. Across many generations, that same water also helps erode the foundation. The thing that sustains the city and the thing that pulls the city down into the earth belong to the same system. That is the kind of tragedy ancient people could easily understand through sacred language. In the Quran, Iram and the people of Ad are placed within a warning about arrogance, strength, and judgment. No matter how powerful a community becomes, it still stands under the authority of the Most High. Tall pillars, sturdy buildings, crowded trade roads, and warehouses full of wealth cannot make a city invulnerable. Archaeology and geology do not remove the weight of that warning. On the contrary, they make the image more concrete. Judgment in religious memory can move through war drought, sandstorms, disease, or the earth itself. With Ubar, the most terrifying image is the earth opening beneath a wealthy city. What people thought was a foundation became an abyss, but from another perspective, especially for those who believe in the law of cause and effect, that disaster was not merely a geological accident. It can also be understood as a punishment from nature and the gods. When a society becomes too wealthy, too powerful, and loses its moral standards, that very corruption brings consequences. Money becomes the highest goal. And for its sake, human beings become willing to do things they once considered unacceptable. And when greed, cruelty, and injustice accumulate long enough, the collapse of an entire corrupt city becomes inevitable. No fire, no invading army, no long process of decline, only disappearance. And that disappearance became the clearest warning of all. A city can be wealthy, powerful, and in control of trade and water. But if the people living there lose humility and forget their limits, their foundation will also weaken in ways they do not recognize. And no civilization can stand firm if it forgets that the gods themselves created human beings and protect human life. And that nature is not something to be conquered, but something to be respected and preserved. Therefore, always remember to protect nature and to hold faith and respect for the gods, my friends. Legend number 8. The ancient city of Sodom, recorded in the Bible, has been found. In 1650 before Christ, on a day nearly 3,700 years ago, the region in the Jordan River Valley, now called Tal el-Hammam, was destroyed in an instant by a powerful force. The scene at that time was this. An object from outer space fell to the ground with a tremendous impact force, like a nuclear explosion, turning stone into molten lava. At the same time, the exploding rock produced a massive shockwave, forming a violent storm with a speed from 900 to 1,200 kilometers per hour, sweeping away the entire city. Wherever it passed, buildings were flattened and residents collapsed in an instant. This is not a fictional scene from a movie, but a research report in the prestigious journal Nature. Scientists say that a cosmic airburst of enormous power, similar to the Tunguska explosion, completely destroyed a city. Some scholars believe that the Bible also recorded this disaster, not only recording the event, but even preserving the name of that city for later generations. It was the ancient city of Sodom. First, let us look at what the scientists say. Through excavation and survey of the Tal el-Hammam site, scientists discovered that this ruin was exposed in a strange condition. In the upper part of the city, there was a magnificent palace complex, standing 12 meters high. The entire walls and upper structures had been damaged, but the vast majority of the lower stone foundations still remained. Some decorative stones and columns showed cracking caused by heat. What remained at the site was a layer that scientists call the destruction layer, 1.5 meters thick. It not only showed a significant difference from the layers above and below it, but was also very different from the entire archaeological stratigraphy of the ancient Near East. Why is it called the destruction layer? Because the artifacts excavated there carry features of extreme destruction, as if they had once been fired at high temperature. For example, pottery fragments whose surfaces appear to have melted into glass, something that requires a temperature of 1500 degrees Celsius to form. There were also metal spherules formed by melting, including iridium spherules that require at least 2466 degrees Celsius to melt, and even platinum spherules that can only form at a temperature of at least 1768 degrees Celsius. There were also dissociated zircon grains, and the dissociation and release of zircon required temperatures reaching 1676 degrees Celsius. These phenomena show that the destruction of this city was connected with extremely high temperatures. Archaeologists believe that war fire, even volcanoes, lightning, and other ordinary factors were not enough to produce such high temperatures and destructive force. Therefore, only one reasonable explanation remains: bombardment by a cosmic asteroid with destructive power 1,000 times greater than the atomic bomb at Hiroshima, destroying this prosperous city in an instant. After simulation calculations, scientists believe that this space rock from the sky had a diameter of about 60 to 75 meters and exploded into a gigantic fireball at a distance from 1 kilometer to 5 kilometers above the ground. The temperature at the center of the explosion exceeded 300,000 degrees Celsius, far higher than the 5,000 degrees Celsius temperature on the surface of the sun. Thermal radiation spread at the speed of light, instantly melting pottery clay and plaster, while the surface temperature rose above 1,850 degrees Celsius in an instant. The residents of the city could not have survived such high heat. The grains of shocked quartz excavated at the site also prove the existence of a massive explosion. Shocked quartz forms under the high pressure and high temperature conditions produced by impact. Inside the quartz, there are one or more sets of fractures aligned with the crystal axis of the quartz, clearly different from natural quartz crystals. Scientists also discovered that after this disaster, the city of Tal el-Hammam and its surrounding areas were abandoned for 300 to 600 years. The population dropped from 45,000 to 60,000 people, down to only a few hundred nomads. Scientists speculate that the power of the explosion caused salt water from the Dead Sea near Tal el-Hammam to evaporate or splash across the valley. The salty water prevented crops from growing, and the survivors of the explosion had to abandon the place. This was the kind of disaster that could end a civilization. Did the Bible record true history? Based on the geographical location of Tal el-Hammam and the way it was destroyed, it is very similar to the city of Sodom recorded in the Bible. This has stirred the interest of researchers. According to the record in Genesis in the Bible, Sodom and Gomorrah were two cities on the plain of Moab by the Jordan River. Because of moral corruption, their sins became so serious that their disgrace reached God Jehovah. Therefore, God prepared to destroy that place. Lot, the nephew of Abraham, happened to be living in this city. And Abraham repeatedly pleaded for Sodom to be spared. 6 times he appealed to God. At first he asked, if there are 50 righteous people in the city, should the city be destroyed? God said, if I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, then for their sake I will forgive all the people there. Abraham perhaps knew for himself the sins of Sodom, so he asked to reduce the number to 45, then 40, then 30, then 20. Finally, Jehovah promised, if there were 10 righteous people in Sodom, then for the sake of those 10 people, the city would not be destroyed. Therefore the Lord sent 2 angels to Sodom to inspect it. If there were still 10 righteous people there, it would be spared. If not, the city should be destroyed. At evening, the 2 angels changed into 2 young men and appeared at the city gate. Lot, Abraham's nephew, happened to be there. Lot bowed down before the angels and invited the two travelers to rest in his house. Lot treated the guests very politely and respectfully, inviting them to eat baked bread for dinner. Unexpectedly, when the two guests were preparing to sleep, a group of men from the city of Sodom came and surrounded Lot's house, shouting, "Bring out the two young men who came to your house tonight so we can deal with them." Lot went outside, closed the door behind him, and pleaded with the people. "My brothers, please do not do this evil thing." He even expressed his willingness to give them his two daughters so that they would spare his guests. Who could have expected that the Sodomites would curse Lot? "You are a foreigner, and yet you dare criticize us. Do you think you are a judge? Now we will harm you as well as those two." Just as the group was preparing to use force and break into the house, the two angels pulled Lot inside. At the same time, the angels displayed their divine power, causing the people outside the door to become dazed, as if they had been struck against an invisible wall. They groped around, but could not find the door of Lot's house and had no choice but to disperse. After that, the two angels revealed their true form and told Lot, "The sin of this city has been heard by Jehovah, and he has called us to destroy this place. If there are any relatives of yours in the city, whoever they may be, all who belong to you, you may take them and leave. This city will be destroyed." Lot immediately went to the two young men of Sodom who were about to marry his daughters, telling them that the Lord was about to destroy the city because of the sins of Sodom, and urging them to flee quickly to save their lives. But neither of them believed him. Lot had no choice but to return. The angels urged Lot to quickly take his family and leave. Lot had to flee Sodom with his wife and two daughters. On the way, the angels told them, "Abandon everything, do not cling to it, and do not look back." Because Lot's wife was still attached to the city, she turned back to look at Sodom. Suddenly, her whole body was surrounded by salt falling from the sky, and she became a pillar of salt. After they escaped, the angels cast down a great fire, and thick smoke rose from Sodom and Gomorrah. The entire plain, together with all the people, animals, and plants, was burned to ashes in an instant by heavenly fire. Today, the two cities reduced to ash have been discovered near the Dead Sea, and the solidified pillar of salt still stands there towering. The heavenly fire descending from the sky in the Bible completely matches the discovery of modern scientists that a great stone passed through the atmosphere and exploded because of friction. The people of Sodom lived on a fertile plain with a developed economy. However, they began indulging in lust and violent behavior. Although the divine is merciful, and God had once promised Abraham that if there were 10 righteous people in Sodom, the city would not be destroyed. A large city like Sodom did not even have 10 righteous people. This led to its destruction. Yet later generations still did not become alert because of it. In addition, according to ancient books and the Bible at that time, besides Sodom and Gomorrah, the two cities of Admah and Zeboim on the plain were also destroyed. Since the 1970s, archaeologists have successively discovered 4 ancient Bronze Age cities near the Dead Sea, corresponding precisely to the 4 cities destroyed in the Bible. Dr. Stephen Collins, the chief archaeologist of the Tal el-Hammam excavation project, supports the claim that Tal el-Hammam is the biblical city of Sodom. He told Asyat News, "First of all, I think the evidence supporting this is beyond doubt. The geographical location, the enormous scale of the city, its date, everything is accurate. It fits the biblical text completely. Second, the research conducted by a team of scientists led by Dr. Phil Silva has provided evidence proving the real existence of an airburst event that destroyed a Middle Bronze Age II city. This event is clearly consistent with the story of the fireball falling upon Sodom and Gomorrah as told in Genesis chapter 19. Christopher R. Moore, Moore, an archaeologist at the Institute of Archaeology and Anthropology at the University of South Carolina, published an article in the magazine The Conversation, saying that the destruction process of the city may have been passed down orally through many generations until it was recorded as the story of Sodom in the Bible. Could this be the account of an ancient eyewitness who saw it with his own eyes? Moore said that if so, it may be the first written record of such a catastrophic event. Thus, the destruction of Sodom was not merely an astronomical phenomenon or a simple religious story. It was the most forceful death sentence against the moral collapse of a civilization, no matter how prosperous it was at its height, no matter how wealthy its economy became when the boundary of sin was broken and even 10 righteous people could not exist. Destruction became an irreversible ending. The thick ash layer beneath the Dead Sea region and the bricks melted at temperatures of thousands of degrees Celsius are the rawest warning to humanity. History has proven clearly a society that loses its moral foundation, and righteousness will surely drag itself down into the abyss and be completely erased from the face of the earth. And yet the brutal sentence of Sodom was not enough to stop the arrogance of humanity. History always repeats destruction when human beings throw away the lessons of the past. More than a millennium after the disaster near the Dead Sea, right in the heart of the mighty Roman Empire, another flourishing metropolis stepped directly into the same old path. The residents there pushed luxury, violence, and lust to their absolute peak. And just as an unavoidable law would demand, the fire of destruction descended once again. The only difference was that this time the heat of 10,000 degrees did not fall from the cosmos, but erupted directly from the towering mountain that had sheltered them for generations. Legend number 9, the fall of Pompeii and the wrath from stone and earth. Nearly 2,000 years ago, precisely in the year 79 after Christ, a violent natural disaster completely erased the ancient Roman city of Pompeii from the map of Italy. Before that fateful day, Pompeii was an extremely prosperous metropolis of the Roman Empire. It gathered wealthy aristocrats, vast arenas, bustling markets, and countless pleasure centers scattered throughout its streets. The residents enjoyed a lively and extravagant life right at the foot of Mount Vesuvius. The tragedy descended with cruelty and speed. Mount Vesuvius suddenly awakened, tore open the sky, and poured millions of tons of pumice and burning ash down upon the city. Lava flows and volcanic debris, clouds rushed down the mountainside at speeds of hundreds of kilometers per hour, sweeping away every obstacle and burying the entire city beneath a layer of ash more than 6 meters thick. Destruction came so quickly that many massive structures and 16,000 residents were buried forever on the spot. The burning ash sealed their bodies tightly. Over time, flesh decomposed, leaving hollow spaces inside the hardened shell of ash and stone. The process of deep burial underground in conditions lacking air and moisture preserved their forms, clothing, and even their final agonized postures with absolute clarity. After that horrifying disaster compared to the prelude of the end of the world, the ruins of Pompeii were forgotten beneath the earth for many centuries. Everything was brought back into the light only when archaeological teams drove their shovels into the area in 1738. They poured liquid plaster into the empty spaces beneath the ash, creating casts that preserved each facial detail of the victims with precision. Today, human beings have excavated more than 2/3 of the city's area, turning it into one of the most visited sites in Italy. Researchers are still working to peel back each layer of earth and catalog the remains. Recent excavations have exposed a brutal truth that shook the academic world. In a restoration project involving 86 victim bodies, researchers found the body of a family hiding in the corner of a house. A child about 4 years old was sitting curled on the mother's stomach. The mother and child clung tightly to each other at the moment the hot ash flow rushed in. The terrified child had run to embrace the mother as the volcano surged toward them, and the stone and earth locked them together. This tragic scene deepened even further when experts discovered the remains of the father and another child lying collapsed right beside them. Expert Stefania Giudice, a manager at the National Archaeological Museum of Naples, offered a forceful assessment. Although the disaster happened 2,000 years ago, we can clearly see a boy, a mother, and a broken family. This is not only the archaeology of science, but also an archaeology that goes deep into the pain of humanity. When they directly began restoring the remains, every member of the research team clearly felt the victims' extreme panic and loss. The safe perspective of the modern age makes it easy for us to separate ourselves from the horror at Pompeii. The exposed truth shows that no one can save himself when disaster beyond human control suddenly arrives. Those poor souls had no idea what was about to happen until they suffocated beneath the hot ash. However, archaeological records have shown that the collapse of this great city was not an accident of nature. The destruction of Pompeii began directly from a way of life whose moral foundation had rotted to the very end. In the final moments before being burned by the fire, one resident used a stone to hastily scratch a forceful last message onto a wall as a warning to later generations. Sin leads to destruction. The archaeological record buried beneath the ash layers exposed the full truth about the crimes that directly brought the death sentence upon this city. At the excavation site, experts found a silver drinking cup engraved with the words, "Enjoy life fully, for tomorrow is hard to predict." This raw slogan absolutely represented the mindset of Pompeii's people at that time. They focused only on gathering the desires before their eyes surrendered themselves to extreme indulgence and threw away all consequences. Could it be that this very worship of endless pleasure shattered every moral boundary and directly pushed an entire mighty metropolis down into the deepest pit of incurable depravity? In reality, from the excavated remains, it can be seen that the ancient city of Pompeii was an urban area with complete infrastructure. Its water system could be called modern, the most advanced in the world at that time. Water supply pipes stretched in every direction beneath the roads, flush toilets had become common in the city, and waste could be drained away through rough ceramic sewers. The streets inside the city were straight and level, and the street design already carried the concept of separating pedestrian and vehicle traffic. The city had a large arena, several outdoor theaters, 3 large public bathhouses, more than 100 restaurants and bars, and many brothels. The residents of Pompeii lived wealthy lives. But the pleasure-seeking arrogance and sexual corruption of that era also began seeping into every level of society from top to bottom. The people of Pompeii were obsessed with eating and drinking. The enjoyment of fine food was the entire meaning of existence for many Pompeians. So in the matter of food, they reached the level of excess. Their menu included crane tongues, lark livers, sea urchins imported from Spain, giraffes from North Africa, flamingos from the Mediterranean, and almost nothing they did not dare to eat. The people of Pompeii even believed that moray eels fed with human flesh tasted delicious, and they fed newly killed slaves to the eels. At that time, eating while reclining was a symbol of status. Wealthy people lay sideways on cushioned marble couches, leaning on one elbow and eating in a horizontal position. Children and people of lower status had to sit while eating, while slaves and servants stood nearby to serve. Dinner banquets often began at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and did not end until midnight, mixed with sexual indulgence and games. The rich feasted by day and reveled wildly by night. To display their wealth, they ate while throwing things away. Expensive pieces of meat were tossed onto the floor after only a few bites. Grape clusters were thrown away after only a few grapes had been eaten. Vulgarity and extravagance were considered fashionable. People became gluttons in order to satisfy their appetites constantly, enjoying rare delicacies from mountains and seas. When they could eat no more, they invented many ways to vomit, and this became a popular trend at the time. Besides, restaurants, brothels, and public bathhouses were the most common places. It was the shovels of archaeologists that stripped bare the true face of this great metropolis. The corruption was not hidden. It was openly exposed right along the traffic routes. Along the smooth paved streets, countless sexual symbols were found, carved in public. They served as a system of signs, marking arrows that led visitors and sailors straight to the brothels scattered across the city. The most famous building, called the Lupanar, was the command center of this industry of lust. The excavation site exposed a ruthless and completely practical structure. The building contained rows of dark rooms with no windows, extremely cramped and narrow. Inside each room stood only a single bed built from a solid block of hard stone. The thin blanket laid over it could not hide the brutal physical exploitation of the slaves imprisoned there. The strongest evidence of depravity lies directly above the doorways. The volcanic ash sealed and preserved intact a series of extremely sensitive frescoes. These wall paintings described every sexual position in raw detail. They carried absolutely no religious artistic value. The brothel owners used these images directly as a service menu. Buyers of sex, especially foreigners who did not speak Latin, only needed to look at the wall and point at a painting to name the price of their desire. This moral decay pierced through the walls of the cramped brothels and spread across all of Pompeii. Drawings and sculptures depicting sexual acts appeared everywhere, in public bathhouses, common eateries, and prominently in the living rooms of the grandest aristocratic villas. The people of the city turned obscenity into a daily habit. The entire great metropolis had become a center for releasing wild desire, shattering every moral boundary with its own hands before Mount Vesuvius poured millions of tons of ash and stone down to cleanse and bury it forever. The decline of Pompeii did not stop inside the dark rooms of the brothels. Alongside lust, the residents of this city also worshiped violence in a savage way. Archaeological shovels struck a gigantic stone arena located on the edge of the city. This place could hold up to 20,000 spectators, and it was built not for sport, but as the scene of public slaughter. The aristocracy and rulers spent money to buy the strongest slaves, armed them with shields and spears, and drove them onto the sand-covered floor. Gladiators were forced to hack and kill each other until one of the two collapsed completely. The enormous stands were always packed with people from every level of society. They gathered only to seek pleasure from the screams of pain and the sight of human flesh being torn open by sharp weapons. The blood of slaves stained the entire arena floor red. The residents of Pompeii applauded wildly as they watched the defeated have their hearts pierced or be brutally torn apart by hungry beasts. Human life and death were turned into cheap entertainment. Extreme violence became a form of daily amusement, sponsored by the authorities. Tens of thousands of people became intoxicated by the stench of blood and the despair of lives they considered lower than their own. That cold-bloodedness added yet another layer of unforgivable sin, sealing Pompeii's death sentence right before Mount Vesuvius roared and poured millions of tons of burning stone down to incinerate everything. At this point, you have probably begun to recognize at least part of the pattern. The collapse of Sodom and Pompeii together form a forceful indictment aimed directly at modern civilization. That destruction did not begin from random geological phenomena. Nature only served as the instrument carrying out the death sentence of a society that had completely rotted from within. Humanity today is repeating the exact same corrupt behaviors from thousands of years ago. Modern people constantly boast about the development of machines and technology, yet tolerate the uncontrolled decline of morality. Violence, bottomless greed, and sexual indulgence are openly ruling every corner of social life. The blood-soaked arenas of Pompeii and the ultimate depravity of Sodom are the rawest reflections of our reality today. History has proven that the law of elimination spares no civilization. Advanced machines or great cities built from reinforced concrete have no ability to withstand real disaster when it arrives. When the final boundary of goodness is trampled underfoot, the mechanism of destruction automatically activates to erase every poisonous seed. Humanity must look straight at the bodies, frozen in ash, and the blackened ruins beneath the earth in order to awaken itself. Restoring righteousness and maintaining a strict moral foundation is the only path to keep the civilization alive before the inevitable wrath of nature. Legend number 10. The ruins of ancient Jericho discovered the city of the Gibborim giants. Jericho is not only a name in the Bible, but also one of the oldest traces of human civilization, when many other lands were still wild, when great centers of power had not yet formed, when human history was still taking its first steps. In the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea, Jericho already existed as a lasting settlement, a place where human beings found water, built walls, raised watchtowers, and formed a community strong enough to survive across many generations, leaving behind layers of remains that still make archaeologists today constantly amazed. Modern excavations. At Tel es Sultan, the area often associated with ancient Jericho, have confirmed countless layers of remains stacked upon one another. Each layer of earth is a period. Each level of brick, each pottery fragment, each collapsed section of wall shows that this city went through repeated cycles of building destruction, rebuilding, and continued existence in a land that always held enormous religious and military significance. Jericho possessed a stable water source, held an important strategic position, and stood like a gateway into the land of Canaan. These very factors made it both an ancient settlement site and the target of many fierce wars. In biblical memory, Jericho is most famous through the story of Joshua leading the people of Israel into the Promised Land after Moses died. That city is described as a sealed fortress with a king's soldiers' walls, drawballs, and warriors that forced the Israelites to face a real challenge before moving deeper into Canaan. But in some traditions of biblical interpretation and extra-canonical lines of storytelling, Jericho also carries a more frightening title, the City of the Giants, where warriors once existed, who were connected with the name Gibborim. The word Gibborim in Hebrew is usually connected with the meaning mighty ones, powerful warriors, heroes of great strength. In Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, after mentioning the Nephilim, the text speaks of figures who became mighty men of old men, of renowned heroes from ancient times, men of reputation. Although it is only a short sentence, its meaning has echoed through many centuries. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the heroes of old men of name. In ancient readings, this passage opens a world very different from the image of ordinary humanity. Before the Great Flood, the earth had the Nephilim. After that, the story of tall, powerful, frightening races continued to appear in the Bible, through names such as Anakim, Rephaim, Emim, Zamzumim, and mighty warriors described with phrases connected to the Gibborim. According to the Enoch tradition, the root of that tragedy began when 200 watchers, high-ranking angels assigned to observe humanity, left their appointed place, descended to the earth, and came in to human women. From that crossing of boundaries, a race of giants was born. They carried strength far beyond human beings and dragged the earth into violence, lust, bloodshed, and chaos before the judgment. That line of storytelling helps explain why many later readers viewed the Nephilim as the ancestors of the giant races that appeared after the flood. In this stream of tradition, the Gibborim are understood as a descendant branch. a class of powerful warriors smaller and more grounded in reality than the original Nephilim, yet still far beyond ordinary people in strength, combat ability, and danger on the battlefield. They may not have reached the terrifying size of the ancient Nephilim in legends exaggerated across many generations. But if we place them in the context of the walled war cities of Canaan, the Gibborim were still terrifying warriors. They were men with large bodies, strong muscles accustomed to heavy weapons, raised in a warrior culture, standing on city walls and serving as defenders of fortified cities. For an army that had just emerged from the wilderness, facing high walls, locked gates, and warriors like these, Jericho certainly created a suffocating feeling. Joshua was the man who had to face that moment. After Moses died, Joshua became the leader of the people of Israel. He carried a tremendous responsibility on his shoulders to lead a people who had wandered 40 years in the wilderness into the land that had been promised. Jericho was the first gate. If this city stood firm, the journey into Canaan would be blocked from the beginning. If Jericho collapsed, the spiritual and military doorway of the Promised Land would open. The story of Jericho is told in Joshua chapter 6 from verse 1 through verse 27. At the beginning of the chapter, the city is described as tightly shut because of the Israelites. No one went out, no one came in. The atmosphere inside the city at that moment must have been extremely tense. Outside stood the camp of Israel. Inside stood the king of Jericho, the soldiers, the residents, the food stores, the city walls, and the warriors placed in position to defend the city. Joshua chapter 6 verse 2 records the word of God spoken to Joshua. I have given Jericho its king and its mighty warriors into your hand. In Hebrew, the phrase translated as mighty warriors is Gibborei Hachayil. This phrase shares the same root idea of strength, heroic action, and the mighty man. Because of this, some biblical interpretations and traditions outside the mainstream have connected the mighty men at Jericho with the concept of the Gibborim in Genesis chapter 6. This detail opens a deeper and weightier way of understanding the story of Jericho. Joshua faced a city with walls, with a king, with an army, with mighty warriors. And in the interpretive tradition about giants, those warriors are connected with the memory of the Gibborim, descendants of giant lines once present in Canaan. Seen from this angle, the Battle of Jericho is not only an ordinary military operation. It becomes a confrontation between the people of Israel and the remnant of an old world, where the fortresses of Canaan were protected by warriors with terrifying reputations. When the walls of Jericho collapsed, Joshua and the Israelite did not merely enter a city whose gate had opened. They entered the center of a fortress where mighty warriors were waiting amid dust, shouting fire and ruin. The Bible says that the people of Israel marched around the city for 6 days. On the 7th day, they marched around the city 7 times. The priests blew the trumpets. The people shouted. The city wall collapsed. The Israelite army rushed in, and the city was destroyed. In the memory of faith, this was a victory by the power of God. Jericho did not fall by ordinary human strength. That city fell when God gave it into Joshua's hand. Modern archaeology also confirms that Jericho is a walled site with ancient occupation layers and traces of destruction and burning in different periods. The specific dating of the Battle of Jericho in the book of Joshua is still debated among scholars. But Jericho itself is a real ancient city, a real location, and the soil layers at Tel es-Sultan truly contain many traces of construction, destruction, and rebuilding. That is what makes the story of the Gibborim at Jericho more fascinating and mysterious. Because if the mighty men in Joshua chapter 6 verse 2 are understood as powerful warriors, then the text shows that this city possessed a military force strong enough to make it a formidable target. If read through, the tradition that connects them with the Gibborim, Jericho appears as the dwelling place of giant warriors descended from older bloodlines. Both readings bring us to the same feeling: Jericho was a strong city, and the clash there was a weighty event in biblical history. So, did giant lines such as the Gibborim, Anakim, or Rephaim still exist after the conquests? The Bible repeatedly mentions tall peoples in Canaan. In Numbers chapter 13, verse 33, the Israelite spies say that they saw the Nephilim, the descendants of Anak, and when they compared themselves with them, the Israelites felt as small as grasshoppers. That statement reflects the very real fear of people who had just seen powerful communities, large bodies, fortified cities, and a frightening warrior culture in Canaan. Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 10 through 11 mentions the Imim, a people numerous, strong, and tall like the Anakim. Also in chapter 2, verses 20 through 21, the text speaks of the Zamzumim, a people strong, numerous, and tall, like the Anakim who once lived in the land of the Ammonites. These groups are linked with the Rephaim, a tall and frightening people, in the memory of the Old Testament. Thus, the Bible does not mention the Nephilim only in Genesis. It also preserves a network of names for giant peoples or tall warrior groups in Canaan and the surrounding regions: Anakim, Rephaim, Amim, Zamzumim, together with mighty men described by phrases related to the Gibborim. Professor Robert C. Newman, a New Testament scholar at Biblical Theological Seminary in Hatfield, Pennsylvania, once discussed the way the term Nephilim is used in Numbers chapter 13, verse 33, especially in connection with the Anakim during the time of the Exodus. According to this reading, the memory of the Nephilim before the flood was connected with the tall peoples of Canaan in the age of Moses and Joshua. Some Jewish traditions and ancient interpretive sources also use very strong images to describe these groups. One tradition speaks of the Gibborim with descriptions so exaggerated that the marrow of each thigh bone was 8 cubits long. A cubit is an ancient measure usually understood as about 18 inches, meaning more than 44 centimeters, or in some other systems of measurement, up to about 21 inches, meaning more than 52 centimeters. That image is clearly legendary, but it shows that the ancients regarded the Gibborim as bodies so large they exceeded ordinary experience. The Anakim are also described in weighty language: their necks reached to the sun. This sentence is not a scientific measurement in the modern sense. It is the ancient way of saying that this people was so tall, so frightening, so different, that the viewer had to use cosmic imagery to describe them. These descriptions may carry the color of exaggeration, but behind them lies a very clear psychological truth. Israel and the communities around Canaan truly remembered certain groups of tall, powerful people with superior fighting ability, who created great fear in confrontations. In that context, Jericho becomes a key point. If this city had mighty warriors, and if some traditions connect them with the Gibborim, then the Battle of Jericho can be understood as a clash between Israel and the remnants of ancient warrior lines in Canaan. Joshua did not simply move toward a walled city. He stepped into a symbol of Canaanite power, where military strength, local belief, and the memory of giants overlapped. The Bible says that the Hebrews burned the city of Jericho. Fire swept through the houses. Smoke rose from the city. Walls collapsed in sections. Warehouses, gates, courtyards, homes, and inner structures were all swept into the destruction. In that context, the question of the fate of the Gibborim becomes haunting. Did they all die in the burning? According to the main narrative of Joshua, the city was destroyed very completely, and only the family of Rahab was saved because she had hidden the Israelite spies. This leads many people to believe that the warrior force inside the city was destroyed when Jericho collapsed and was burned. However, some traditions outside the Bible tell another direction. According to a few ancient sources and Jewish legends about the Canaanite peoples after the conquest, a portion of survivors fled from the land and went to Africa. Some accounts connect this migration with the figure Ifrikish ibn Qais, According to that tradition, the fleeing group reached Africa, defeated a local king, and settled there. Later, some storylines even connected them with the Berber people of North Africa. Another source comes from Procopius of Caesarea, a scholar who lived in late antiquity. He wrote that certain peoples had once left the land of Canaan and fled to Africa after conflicts with Joshua. In that line of narration, they settled in Libya, spread throughout North Africa, and traveled as far as the region of the Pillars of Hercules, meaning the area of the present-day Strait of Gibraltar. These stories need to be understood as ancient historical traditions and ethnic legends, not yet something that can be placed on the same level as modern archaeology. But they show one remarkable thing. The memory of tall peoples, Canaanite warriors, and groups fleeing after the time of Joshua persisted for a very long time in Jewish, Christian, and ancient historical memory. Therefore, the story of Jericho does not stop at a battle. It opens a wider file about giants in the Bible. Genesis mentions the Nephilim and the heroes of old. Numbers mentions the Anakim who terrified the Israelites. Deuteronomy mentions the Rephaimim and Zamzumim as tall and powerful groups. Joshua tells of Jericho, a tightly sealed city with a king and mighty warriors. Traditions outside the Bible connect some of these groups with the Gibborim, with Canaan, with Joshua's wars, and with migrations toward Africa. When all of this is placed side by side, Jericho appears as an intersection between archaeology, the Bible, and the legend of giants. On the ground, Jericho is one of the oldest cities ever excavated. In the Bible, Jericho is the first city that blocked Israel's path as they entered the Promised Land. In the legend of the Gibborim, Jericho is the place where mighty warriors may have stood on the walls, defending an old order about to be judged. What gives this story weight is the very concrete reality of the site. Tel es-Sultan is not a vague name. The soil layers there are real. The walls, towers, ditches, houses, and traces of occupation are real. This ancient city existed across many periods, received water from the spring area, became a place where human beings held on in a hot, dry land, and was destroyed and reborn many times. Therefore, when the Bible tells of Jericho, that story stands on the foundation of a real place, a real city, and a land that has witnessed far too many layers of history. The Gibborim bring another haunting layer into the story. The fear of ancient warriors with strength beyond ordinary people descendants, connected by tradition, with the bloodline of the Nephilim figures who once made smaller peoples tremble when standing before the walls of Canaan. This helps us understand why the victory at Jericho carries such great meaning in the Bible. It is not merely the story of a wall falling. It is the moment when God opened the way for the people of Israel, before a city considered fortified, before a Canaanite king, before mighty warriors, and before even the memory of ancient powers that once made human beings afraid. From the perspective of faith, Jericho collapsed because God had given that city into Joshua's hand. From the perspective of history, Jericho is one of the oldest sites of humanity, once having walls, residence, war, and layers of destruction. From the perspective of legend, Jericho is the city where the trace of the Gibborim may have touched the biblical story, connecting Genesis chapter 6 with Joshua chapter 6 by a haunting thread. In the end, the story of Jericho in the book of Joshua does not necessarily need to be tied to the legend of the Gibborim in order to have meaning. What the biblical text describes is fairly clear. Outside, the Israelites blew trumpets and shouted. Inside, the city walls collapsed and the defenders were defeated. The warriors of Jericho, even if considered mighty, still could not withstand the attack. There is no direct detail in this passage confirming the presence of giants or Gibborim in the legendary sense. Jericho was burned. The fortress was completely destroyed. This event marked the collapse of a fortified stronghold before the power of God. Therefore, even when separated from outside layers of interpretation and legend, the story from Genesis to Joshua still holds a clear message. No human power can stand firm when facing the will of God. The fall of Jericho marked the brutal sentence against a solitary fortress. Yet the geological layers of the earth preserve a scene of destruction millions of times greater in scale. Long before the walls of Jericho were flattened, humanity once endured an ultimate cleansing one that drowned the entire surface of the planet beneath thousands of meters of water. Let us continue digging deep into the ancient layers of mud and earth to face the most terrifying catastrophe ever recorded by history. Legend number 11. The Great Flood, a global sentence carved in water and ice. Mainstream scholars have always tried to reduce the Great Flood into a collection of independent myths or small local floods that happen to resemble one another. The truth engraved in stone and earth proves the opposite. The Great Flood was a single global catastrophe that directly reset the entire biosphere of the earth and erased almost all of prehistoric humanity. The event of a colossal flood sent by the divine to destroy sinful humanity appears with absolute force across every culture. We find chilling overlap in independent ancient texts, Noah's refuge in the Hebrew Bible, the ship of Utnapishtim in the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, the event of Manu in India, Deucalion in ancient Greece, and even the oral records of indigenous peoples in North America. This perfect consistency confirms that civilizations across the earth all endured the same extinction event together. Local flood disasters only spread short-term terror and completely fade from the minds of the people after a few decades. However, the Great Flood left an unerasable scar in the cultural DNA of all humanity. A catastrophe powerful enough to carve itself into the collective memory of humankind for thousands of years. Had to be a terrifying experience that continued across many generations, far beyond every human limit of defense. The direct culprit behind this apocalypse was the sudden rise of sea level at the end of the Ice Age. The melting process erased millions of square kilometers of land across the globe. A sea level rise of more than 120 meters completely swallowed every prehistoric civilization that had always tended to settle in low plains and coastal regions. This act of swallowing did not happen gently, giving people enough time to evacuate. Research published on December 4, 2010 on Science News under the title, "Global Sea Level Rise at the End of the Ice Age," interrupted by jumps shattered the idea of a slow and gentle flood. From around 17,000 before Christ to 4,000 before Christ, average sea level rose by about 1 meter per century. Yet, mixed into that process were extreme surges of up to 5 meters per century, especially concentrated in two periods, 13,000 before Christ to 11,000 before Christ, and 9,000 before Christ to 7,000 before Christ. The destructive power reached its peak around the 8th millennium before Christ. The sharp rise in global temperature accelerated the melting of gigantic ice sheets. Billions of tons of fresh water accumulated and formed two enormous glacial lakes in North America, Lake Agassiz and Lake Ojibwe. When the ice dam broke apart, the entire mass of water poured straight into the North Atlantic. Lake Agassiz alone, a body of water covering 440,000 square kilometers larger than all the modern Great Lakes combined, was powerful enough to directly force global sea level to surge upward by 2.7 meters almost immediately. The rupture of the Agassiz Dam ignited the most brutal chain reaction in climate history. Around 8,000 before Christ, billions of cubic meters of freezing freshwater crashed into the ocean and completely disrupted the planet's heat-circulating ocean currents. The Earth was immediately thrown back into a smaller ice age, creating the climate event known as the 8.2 kilo-year event, submerging the entire surface of the globe in ice and extreme weather for 4 continuous centuries. At the very height of that destruction, the final massive rise of seawater crushed through the Bosporus Strait. Salt water from the Mediterranean roared into the freshwater lake of the Black Sea with a force 200 times greater than Niagara Falls. A UNESCO study in 2005 confirmed that this catastrophe occurred around 8,000 before Christ, completely overturning the earlier 5,600. before Christ hypothesis proposed by Ryan and Pittman. This merciless flood directly swept away and erased every human settlement around the Black Sea region. It was during this period of extreme chaos that most coastal civilizations on Earth were wiped clean. Sea levels rising by 6 to 9 meters per century, combined with harsh glacial weather, crushed every effort of survival and rebuilding among the survivors. The recovery of humanity only truly began after 7,000 before Christ, when sea levels stopped going mad and began to stabilize again. Human beings gradually left the caves in the high mountains and moved down to settle again along the coasts from 6,000 before Christ to 5,000 before Christ. Academia defines the recorded history of humanity as beginning from this period. That is absolutely not a coincidence. Our ancestors before that point in time were not primitive or ignorant. It is simply that the first pages of human history, along with their entire brilliant civilization, were swept away by the Great Flood and buried forever beneath the deep mud at the bottom of the ocean. The arrogance of modern scholars suffered another devastating blow when sonar technology and deep diving equipment pierced through the darkness of the sea floor. Those prehistoric civilizations did not vanish without a trace. Their ruins still exist in the form of monolithic stone blocks, gigantic plazas, and sturdy city walls. They lie silently beneath dozens of meters of salt water, exposing the strongest physical evidence for the swallowing power of the Great Flood. In 2001, the National Institute of Ocean Technology in India conducted radar scans beneath the floor of the Gulf of Khambhat. The ultrasonic equipment returned images of a gigantic metropolis stretching more than 9 kilometers, lying at a depth of 40 meters below sea level. Diving teams swam directly down to the site and pulled to the surface a series of stone building materials, fired pottery fragments, household tools, and even human bones. Carbon isotope measurements pinned the age of the site at up to 9,500 years. This number shatters the entire current history textbook model. It proves that a highly prosperous urban civilization had already taken root on land just before the end of the Ice Age, only to be swallowed whole by the extreme rise of the sea in a single blink of geological history. The remains of the ocean's victims are not found only in India. Moving across to the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni structure lying deep beneath the Pacific Ocean exposes squared stairways, straight edges, and flat platforms cut with technical precision. This great architectural mass was covered by seawater exactly 10,000 years ago, matching perfectly with the timeline of melting ice dams that caused global sea levels to surge. Along the coast of Greece, archaeological work has continued to uncover the city of Pavlopetri, submerged beneath the waters of the Mediterranean. The foundations of numerous houses, straight-planned roads, and a complex drainage system still lie in orderly layers beneath the sea. These drowned metropolises are absolutely not products of imagination or mythic drawings on parchment scrolls. They are gigantic tombstones of flesh and blood civilizations. These ruins confirm a raw historical truth. Humanity had already risen to the peak of civilization tens of thousands of years ago. But all of those achievements were swallowed by the open mouth of the ocean, when nature activated the mechanism to reset the entire surface of the planet. And yet, human history is not stained with brutality only because of geological disasters. When the ground became dry and new empires rose, human beings created with their own hands nightmares even more horrifying than the fury of the ocean. That brutality did not descend from the sky. It was born directly from blood-soaked hands upon religious pyramids. We now close the flooded files and step straight into the center of fear, facing the cruelest weapon of psychological manipulation in the ancient world. Chapter 3. The Sound of Death and Blood Sacrifice. Legend number 12, the war scream of the Aztecs, the skull-shaped death whistle. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Excavation teams repeatedly dug up countless small clay objects shaped like human skulls from mass graves in Mexico. Mainstream scholars at that time made a foolish mistake. They looked at these hand-molded objects and casually labeled them harmless children's toys or cheap decorative items used in funerals. All of those clay whistles were gathered up, tossed carelessly into cardboard boxes, and pushed deep into the dark corners of museum storage rooms. The arrogance and carelessness of the experts sealed away one of the most terrifying weapons of the ancient world for decades. That buried truth was officially exposed only in 1999. An archaeological team was directly excavating the ruins of the temple of the wind god Ehecatl in the Tlatelolco area of Mexico City. Their shovels struck the scene of a brutal sacrificial ritual. Deep beneath the stone lay the intact skeleton of a 20-year-old young man who had been decapitated. The victim's bony hands were locked in a position holding two skull-shaped clay objects crossed directly in front of his chest. This extremely solemn burial position forced the experts to discard the toy theory and reevaluate their function. This time, one researcher accompanying the excavation team picked up the object, cleaned away the dirt and sand, placed it against his lips, and blew a strong breath into it. The escaping air created a shock that completely collapsed the psychology of everyone present at the scene. It was absolutely not the sound of a bamboo flute or an ordinary musical instrument. The sound that came out was the piercing scream of a person undergoing extreme torture, mixed directly with the roaring howl of a wild hurricane. Modern sound engineers immediately placed the whistle into a three-dimensional sectional scanner. The data returned exposed a level of craftsmanship far beyond its time. Aztec artisans had placed inside that small clay object a hollow structure that accurately mimicked the shape of the human larynx. The airflow was forced through narrow openings, slammed violently against hollow internal walls, and was amplified directly outward. This acoustic structure produced an extreme frequency range that struck straight into the amygdala of the human brain, immediately triggering intense panic and survival instinct in anyone who heard it. The historical record immediately shattered the original assumption the Aztec Empire did not mold these death whistles for entertainment. Archaeology confirms that they were an extremely brutal weapon of psychological destruction. On blazing battlefields, tens of thousands of Aztec warriors would raise these skull whistles to their lips at the same time and blow hard right before the moment of close combat. Tens of thousands of ghostly screams tore through the air at once, creating a mass of deadly sound. This sound wave completely crushed the enemy's will to resist and paralyzed their nerves even before the obsidian spear points ever touched flesh. The presence of the skull whistle is also tightly bound to the bloodiest legends of Aztec civilization. Their religious system recorded very clearly, Mictlan, the deepest and most terrifying underworld, ruled by the death god Mictlantecutli. Aztec legend states that in order to reach Mictlan, the soul of the dead had to pass through mountain passes filled with brutal winds, carrying tens of thousands of razor-sharp stone fragments that cut flesh apart. The whistle was crafted to produce a sound that precisely imitated those winds of the underworld. In the terrifying sacrificial rituals on top of the pyramids, that chilling sound was always played at the very moment the Aztec priest used an obsidian knife to tear open the chest and pull out the victim's still-beating heart. The Aztec people firmly believed that this sound of death was the power of the gods, strong enough to drive away evil spirits and open the way to guide the victim's soul through the dark realm of the dead. The skull whistle had gone far beyond the function of an object. It became a symbol of absolute power, locking the bloody domination of the Aztec Empire in place through extreme fear rooted deep in the human mind. Legend number 13. Human sacrifice in the bogs of Europe. Tollund, man in the cord still around his neck. In many regions of northern Europe, bogs have long carried a meaning very different from ordinary land. They are places where earth and water mix together. One footstep can sink into soft mud. An object thrown into them can lie still for hundreds, even thousands of years. For the ancient Celts and Germanic peoples, bogs like these were often seen as boundaries between human life and the sacred realm. They brought weapons, jewelry, precious objects, and sometimes even human lives to those places as offerings sent to the supernatural powers they believed governed earth-water harvests and the fate of the community. For a long time, many modern people viewed those stories as exaggerated accounts. Roman authors once described the northern tribes with many strange rituals, so later historians often asked, was this the truth? Or merely the way the Romans darkened the image of barbarian peoples they wanted to conquer? Those debates continued quietly across many generations. Then, in 1950 in central Denmark, a discovery in a layer of peat forced people to look again at the entire issue. Two peat cutters were working in the Bjeldskovdal bog near Silkeborg. Their shovels went down into the familiar black earth where local people commonly dug peat for fuel. In the middle of the dark mud, a human face suddenly appeared. The face was intact. The eyes were closed. The mouth was shut. The folds of skin, the beard on the chin, and the facial features remained so clear that the two workers thought they had just discovered someone who had recently died. They stopped at once and called the police. At that time, the area of Denmark had seen several troubling missing person cases, so that reaction was completely understandable. However, the analyses that followed sent the entire story in a completely different direction. The man lying in that peat layer had lived during the Iron Age, more than 2,000 years ago. He was called Tollund man. Analysis showed that he belonged to an ancient Germanic community in northern Europe, living during the Iron Age, around more than 2,000 years ago. This was a period when the tribes in this region did not yet have their own writing system, and life was closely tied to farming, hunting, and spiritual beliefs connected with nature. What made this discovery famous around the world was the extraordinary preservation of the body. Peat bogs have a very particular environment, cold, lacking oxygen, rich in natural acids, and containing substances that slow the process of decay. Because of this, the skin, hair, facial features, and part of the internal organs of Tollund man were preserved in a rare way. He did not look like an ancient skeleton in an ordinary excavation pit. He looked like a man who had fallen into a very deep sleep, then been kept intact by time inside the earth, causing those who first saw him to be astonished by a degree of preservation almost beyond imagination. Around his neck, a carefully braided leather cord still remained. This detail immediately drew the attention of researchers. This was not a cord that had accidentally caught on the body. It had a clear form, was handmade, had a knot, and its position showed that Tollund man had died in an intentional ritual. Scientists determined that he died by hanging. That statement is easy to understand and avoids confusion. It describes the cause that forensic analysis can see, while still leaving open the meaning behind. It was he, a criminal punished under community law, or a person chosen for an offering ritual. The way his body was arranged in the bog has led many people to lean toward the second hypothesis. Tollund man was not left behind hastily. His body was placed in a slightly curled position, almost like someone lying down to rest. The eyes and mouth were closed. His face held a strangely peaceful expression. Whoever carried this out seems to have taken time to arrange him very carefully before letting the peat cover him. This is the important point. A hurried punishment often leaves a sense of disorder. An accident usually leaves random traces. Tollund man, however, lay in the bog with clear care. The way the body was placed shows that the people of that time regarded his descent into the bog as an act with ritual meaning. They believed this place was a crossing point between the human world and the sacred realm, so placing him there was like sending a message, an offering, or a representative to the other side. Examination also revealed his final meal. Before he died, Tollund man ate a porridge made from grains and seeds. Modern analyses show that the meal included familiar ingredients from the Iron Age, such as barley flaxseed and certain wild seeds. Some research has even recorded traces of fish in the meal. This makes the image of his final hours very concrete. Before entering the ritual, he was given a simple meal, much like the everyday food of people in that time. This detail makes the story quieter and more solemn. Tollund Man is no longer a distant archaeological artifact. He once had a final day, a final meal, a community around him, and a belief that he or the people who placed him into the bog lived with. From here, the ancient stories about Northern European bog rituals become difficult to dismiss. The ancient Celts and Germanic peoples placed many things into bogs: weapons, after battle jewelry pots, boats, precious objects, and in some cases, human beings. To them, a bog was not simply wet ground. It was a boundary zone. Objects sent down into it left the ordinary world and entered a more sacred layer. This helps explain why many discoveries in European bogs show very unusual treatment. Some people were placed down carefully. Some still carried personal belongings. In some places, objects were bent or deformed before being offered into the water, as if they had to be separated from everyday life before being sent to another realm. All of this shows that the ancients did not act randomly. They had a very clear belief system. They believed the gods, or invisible powers, could receive offerings through the bog. When the harvest failed, when war threatened, when the community needed to ask for protection, they brought their most precious things to those black waters. In that context, Tollund Man becomes very strong evidence. He lay in the bog with the cord still around his neck. His final meal in his stomach, his body carefully arranged, and his face preserved in peace. These details do not resemble a random accident. They resemble a ritual that was prepared, carried out, and completed according to an order that the community of that time understood very clearly. For that reason, many researchers see Tollund Man as a case possibly connected with human sacrifice. The word sacrifice here must be understood correctly. In the ancient world, people often believed that the community could communicate with the gods through offerings. Those offerings could be food, weapons, precious objects, animals, or in special cases, human beings. From a modern perspective, such an act is difficult to accept. But for people of that time, it may have been understood as a sacred duty, a way to send the most important thing of the community to the gods in order to ask for balance, harvest victory, or peace. What makes Tollund Man special is his silence. He left behind no account. The people who placed him into the bog also left no written explanation. All that remains is the body, the cord, the final meal, the position in which he lay, and the peat layer that preserved him for more than 2,000 years. Those seemingly silent details join together into a clear picture. The cord around the neck shows an intentional death. The final meal reflects preparation. The position of the body shows careful arrangement. The bog confirms the ritual context. Thanks to the extraordinary preservation, modern science can follow each trace, even though the people involved vanished a very long time ago. Therefore, Tollund Man is considered one of the important discoveries of the European Iron Age. He was not a powerful figure and left behind no great monument, but his face preserved across more than 2 millennia opens a direct view into the spiritual life of an ancient community. Through this case, we can see that the ancient Northern Europeans regarded bogs as sacred places used to send offerings into another world. Weapons, precious objects, and even human beings could be placed there with the meaning of dedication, representing the community before the powers they believed governed nature and life. This is what makes the story both heavy and profound. Tollund Man may have been treated by his community with solemnity in his final moments. The way they closed his eyes and placed him down shows that they believed he was entering another journey, not simply leaving earthly life. They may have thought he carried a message, a plea, or a great offering to the gods of the bog. Modern historians, therefore, have had to look again at ancient records with greater caution. The Romans may have exaggerated many things when writing about the northern tribes. They had political purposes, the viewpoint of conquerors, and prejudice against peoples outside the Roman world. But archaeology shows one part very clearly. The bogs of northern Europe truly were places where offering activities took place. And in some cases, human beings became part of those rituals. Tollund man is concrete evidence of this issue. He does not belong to vague legend, but to a real archaeological discovery examined through forensic science, dated, analyzed through his final meal, and clearly recorded through the way his body was placed. These facts take bog ritual out of the realm of rumor and place it into the scientific record. Judging by the traces, the ritual may have taken place according to a clear sequence. First came the location. The bog was chosen because it carried the meaning of a boundary. This was a place where earth was not quite earth and water was not quite water. A person stepping into it could feel as if they were approaching a region different from everyday life. That very feeling made the bog suitable for ritual. Then came the preparation. Tollund man had a final meal. That meal was very simple, but its presence in scientific analysis has led many people to think he was prepared before entering the rite. A bowl of grain porridge from everyday life suddenly becomes the final trace of a human being before his name entered history. Next came the ending of life. The leather cord around his neck shows that this act was carried out through a specific method. It was not an accident in the bog. It was intentional and occurred before he was placed into the peat layer. Finally came the way he was lowered into the bog. This is the detail that says the most. He was placed carefully, his eyes and mouth closed, his body set in a peaceful position. They did not throw him away, nor did they leave him in a state of disorder. That method shows a ritual with order belief and a certain degree of respect for the one who had been offered. All of this comes together into a clearer picture. The bog was the sacred place. The meal was part of the preparation. The cord was the trace of the rite. The resting position was the way of sending him onward. The peaceful face is what makes modern people stop the longest when they look at him, without using words that are too heavy. The story of Tollund man is still haunting enough. Its power lies in a truth that feels too close, a man from the Iron Age, with a face still bearing human expression, lying quietly beneath the peat for more than 2,000 years. Then returning before the eyes of the modern world as a silent witness of ancient belief. He shows that the ancestors of Europe once lived in a world where nature, the gods, and the community were tightly bound together. Favorable rain harvests, war illness, and life itself were all seen through a sacred lens. When they needed to ask for something great, they went to the bog where they believed the human voice could reach another realm. Today we can look at that story through archaeology, forensic science, chemistry, and the history of religion. But for those who once placed Tollund man into the peat layer, it may have been a very solemn ritual. They were doing only what they believed was right at that moment. And the peat preserved it all. That is why Tollund man became one of the most important discoveries about European bog rituals. He stands between two worlds, the ancient world where the bog was a sacred doorway, and the modern world where science tries to reread every trace on his body in order to understand how ancient people lived, believed, and offered. In the end, the story of Tollund man reminds us that ancient legends sometimes began from very real practices. The records about Celts and Germanic peoples making offerings in bogs may have been viewed by the Romans through prejudice. But archaeological discoveries show that those wetlands truly held a major role in Northern European religious life. The bog was once a place that held weapons, a place where precious objects were sent, a place where human beings placed their faith in a connection with the gods. And in the case of Tollund man, it also preserved the face of a person who passed through that ritual in a silence lasting more than 2 millennia. Leave your comment right below this video. In your view was Tollund man, the victim of an ancient ritual or evidence that Iron Age people truly saw the bog as a doorway into another world. The cold boglands of Europe preserved the bodies of sacrificial victims in silence for thousands of years. The black peat covered the face, the cord the final meal, and even the way the ancients placed a human being down into their sacred ground. That story closes one dark doorway of ancient ritual, then opens into a wider, louder, and more violent landscape, the battlefield. Because human cruelty has never existed only inside acts of ritual offering. When power, wealth, and ambition expanded beyond control, human beings began using bronze spears, wooden shields, war chariots, warships, and fire to settle every dispute. City walls were built higher to resist enemies. Gates were locked tight. Granaries were filled. Soldiers stood on watchtowers staring toward the horizon, waiting for an army to arrive. And in ancient memory, very few cities carry as much weight as Troy. Chapter 4. The Ashes of War and the Sword of God. Legend number 14, the city of Troy and the Trojan War, 9 layers of ruins, drowned in ash and charcoal. For thousands of years, Troy was not only a name in poetry, but a story filled with blood, fire, and tragedy. Everything began with what seemed like a small mistake. Prince Paris of Troy took Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, away from Sparta. But Helen was not merely a woman. She was the honor of Greece. In a short time, the kings of Greece gathered their forces. Thousands of warships cut through the waves of the Aegean, carrying the most famous warriors, the undefeated Achilles, the ambitious Agamemnon, and the cunning Odysseus. They came before the gates of Troy, determined to reclaim honor through war. Troy did not fall easily. The city stood firm behind high walls and courageous warriors such as Hector, the final defender of his homeland. The war dragged on year after year. Blood was spilled across the fields, and duels decided the fate of each passing day. Achilles killed Hector. Troy lost its heart. But the war was still not over. After 10 years of deadlock, the Greeks launched a daring plan. They pretended to withdraw, leaving behind a gigantic wooden horse before the city gate. The Trojans, believing victory had finally come, pulled the horse inside as a trophy. Night fell. From inside the horse, Greek warriors quietly stepped out. They opened the city gates. The Greek army returned in the darkness. Troy was ambushed. Fire erupted everywhere. The city collapsed in chaos. Those who had once lived behind strong walls now fled in despair. King Priam was killed. Families were shattered. A civilization turned into ash in a single night. That story is not only legend. It is a reminder that one mistake, one decision, or one careless moment can pull an entire city into collapse. Then, at the end of the 19th century, one man decided to read Homer in an entirely different way. Heinrich Schliemann, a wealthy merchant, who turned to archaeology, believed that the epic might still be hiding a map. He saw those poetic lines not only as art, but as the geographical memory of a real city. He followed the ancient descriptions, paying attention to the Troad region in northwestern Asia Minor, near the entrance to the Dardanelles Strait, which connects the Aegean Sea with the Sea of Marmara and farther beyond to the Black Sea. That position was extremely important in the ancient world. Whoever controlled this region could oversee one of the most important maritime trade routes between Europe and Asia. Schliemann brought his excavation team to the mound of Hisarlik, located on the northwestern coast of what is now Turkey. From the outside, Hisarlik looked like a large mound rising from the plain. But when the first cuts of excavation pierced through the soil, the true nature of the hill gradually appeared. It was an enormous archaeological complex. Beneath the soil of Hisarlik, archaeologists discovered many ancient cities stacked on top of one another. Not just one Troy, but an entire chain of Troys. One city was destroyed, then later generations leveled the ruins, filled in ash, brick, and stone, and then built a new city directly on the old foundation. That process repeated across many centuries, turning Hisarlik into a many-layered cake of history. Later, archaeologists numbered the main layers from Troy 1 to Troy 9. 9 layers of cities, 9 periods of building, living, destruction, and rebuilding. 9 times human beings returned to the same location, rebuilt houses, walls, gates, storage rooms, roads, and places of worship on top of what previous generations had left behind. This completely changed the way people saw Troy. A name once placed in the realm of poetry suddenly became earth-stone walls, brick, ash, pottery, metal, and traces of settlement that could be touched by hand. Of course, Schliemann also left behind many controversies. His excavation methods were far too aggressive by modern archaeological standards. He once dug deep through many important layers and mistakenly identified Troy II as the Troy of King Priam in the epic. Later archaeologists such as Wilhelm Dörpfeld and Carl Bliegen corrected the sequence, studied more carefully, and drew attention to the layers Troy VI and Troy VII a meaning. The cities from the late Bronze Age, close to the setting, many people connect with the tradition of the Trojan War. Troy VI appears as a great fortress. Its walls were built from cut limestone. The base of the wall was several meters thick and sloped slightly to increase stability. The walls had towers, gates, and a defensive system showing that this was a true center of power, not a small coastal village. From that position, Troy looked down over the plain and controlled the region near the Dardanelles. In the ancient world, this position held tremendous value. Ships traveling through the Aegean Black Sea route may have had to pay attention to this place. Goods, metals, grain, horses, timber, wine, oil, and products from many different regions could pass through the trade network around it. A city located at such a gateway could easily become wealthy, easily attract attention, and just as easily become a target of war. Troy VI ended in a powerful event. Many researchers connect its collapse with an earthquake. Large sections of wall-fell structures were damaged, and the date of this layer seems earlier than the period usually connected with a war in Greek tradition. But after Troy VI, the city was rebuilt. That was Troy 7a. This city layer appears more crowded, more tense, and carries signs of a community preparing for a difficult period. Houses were built closer together. Many large storage jars called pithoi were buried into house floors to store food. This arrangement suggests that the inhabitants were stockpiling supplies like a city preparing for the possibility of siege. This point is crucial. A city living normally builds houses according to the needs of daily life. A city sensing danger uses every empty space, brings more people inside the walls, stores food, and prepares to endure a siege. Troy 7. It carries exactly that feeling. When archaeologists peeled back this layer, a very different scene appeared. Burn marks, broken pottery arrowheads, signs of destruction, and human remains found inside houses or on streets show that the city went through a violent event. Many scholars view Troy 7a as the closest candidate for the Troy remembered in the Greek war tradition. Here, epic and archaeology begin to stand very close to each other. Homer tells of a city under siege. Archaeology shows signs of a community preparing for such a situation. Legend speaks of warfare around city walls. At Hisarlik, the soil preserves traces of burning weapons and destruction. The epic emphasizes the importance of Troy. Geography explains why this place became a point of conflict. These points do not turn the Iliad into an exact battlefield record in every detail. Homer wrote poetry, and the oral tradition had lasted for many generations before the text took shape. The characters' speeches, gods, and battle scenes all carry the language of epic. But behind that poetic layer is a very clear historical core. At Hisarlik, there once existed a wealthy, powerful walled city in a strategic position. and at least one late Bronze Age layer of the city ended in a violent event. What was once dismissed as a story began to stand on real ground. Troy 7. A reveals a city that was besieged and destroyed. Houses were built densely. Many large jars were buried beneath floors to store food, showing signs of preparation to endure a siege. Bronze Age warfare was a process of grinding pressure, lack of food, constant strain attacks on gates arrows, shot over walls, and attempts to break the defensive line. When the defense collapsed, the city could be taken very quickly. Archaeology shows that Troy 7A was destroyed by fire. Burn marks spread widely. Objects were broken and left in place, proving that the inhabitants did not have time to leave. This is clear evidence of a violent event. For that reason, Troy 7A is considered the city layer closest to the memory of the war in Greek tradition. From there, the story of the wooden horse can be understood as a symbol of a city overcome by strategy or by losing its guard. Although the detail of the horse belongs more to later epic tradition than to the main body of the Iliad, it reflects a very real memory of ancient warfare. A fortified city usually falls only when the enemy finds a way past its walls. That could be through strategy, an insider deception, a broken gate, or a sudden event that makes the defensive line useless. The ancients condensed that fear into the image of a gigantic wooden horse, a gift that seemed harmless but brought the enemy into the heart of the city. The image of the wooden horse reflects one reality. Fortresses often collapse from within, not only from attacks outside. With Troy, archaeology does not need to confirm every detail of the legend. Hisarlik has provided enough evidence: a real city, strong fortification walls, traces of destruction, a burn layer, and an important strategic position. Troy shows that legend can preserve historical memory. The ancients retold war through poetry, but behind it stood a real age: coastal cities, trade routes, warrior alliances, and long sieges. Hisarlik is clear evidence. 9 city layers stacked on top of one another show a continuous process of building, destruction, and rebuilding. Among them, Troy 6 was a great fortress, while Troy 7A carries signs of siege and an ending in fire. The Trojan War may have been the result of many real events being passed down orally and connected together. Earthquakes, conflicts, trade disputes, and collective memory. The Iliad survived for so long because it reflects the nature of war, honor, power, and the price that must be paid. Figures such as Achilles, Hector, and Priam represent the choices and tragedies within war. Troy shows that war does not need mythology in order to become terrifying. A city, no matter how strong, can still collapse quickly when caught in conflict. The people are the ones who suffer the direct consequences. The forces that led to war at Troy's strategic position, trade alliances, and ambition have continued to repeat throughout history. Archaeology at Hisarlik proves that Troy was not merely a myth. It is a combination of legend, archaeological remains, and the memory of war. The soil layers, city walls, burn marks, and weapons show that a city was destroyed in violence. This brings Troy out of the realm of epic and places it into real history. In the end, Troy emphasizes one truth: war leaves behind more than victory. Beneath the soil lie the ruins of interrupted lives, broken walls, shattered objects, and traces of human beings. That is the true nature of war. Troy is proof that legend can begin from history, and every layer of ash beneath the ground is a warning about the consequences of ambition and conflict. Legend number 15. The Amazon warrior women, the remains of Scythian women, buried with weapons and real battle wounds. Before the smoke and dust of Troy had even cleared, the shovel of archaeology tore open another blood-soaked legend of the ancient world. For thousands of years, Greek writings had always spoken of the Amazons, a brutal tribe of female warriors who rode horses, shot bows with deadly accuracy, and were ready to slaughter any enemy who stood in their way. Ancient historians fixed this tribe at the edge of the civilized world, around the wild Black Sea region. This society was ruled absolutely by women and operated through extreme cruelty. Men were stripped of all human rights. The Amazon warrior force abducted men from neighboring tribes only to preserve their bloodline during brief mating periods, then immediately killed them or turned them into blind slaves. Ancient documents recorded clearly the blood-soaked law of survival of this tribe from the very moment of birth. Baby boys, once born, were immediately slaughtered and their bodies thrown to wild beasts, or their arms and legs were broken, so they would remain permanently disabled servants. By contrast, baby girls were kept alive and thrown straight into a brutal military training environment, turned into killing machines from the moment they first learned to walk. The name Amazon in the Greek language was explained in an extremely ruthless way, without a breast. Ancient texts claim that these women directly used red-hot knives to cut off or completely wither their own right breast. This cruel act of cutting their own flesh removed every physical obstacle from the body. Eliminating the right breast allowed them to draw the bowstring tightly against the chest and launch bronze arrows with maximum piercing force. The bloodthirsty violence of the Amazon army directly threatened every neighboring nation. Greek epics repeatedly described brutal close combat battles between this army of women and the strongest forces in the world. Queen Penthesilea once personally led tens of thousands of female cavalry straight into the battlefield of Troy. They rode horses without saddles, gripped double battle axes in both hands, hacked apart the formations of the Greek army, and slaughtered large numbers of soldiers before being struck down by Achilles with a spear. In another campaign, Queen Hippolyta deployed her forces and fought Hercules in a battle to the death. In the eyes of the ancient Greeks, the Amazons had completely cast aside every standard of feminine weakness. These women craved war, regarded wounds as honor, and treated the severed heads of enemies, displayed on spear points, as the only measure of their own worth. Conservative historians once dismissed this story outright. They judged the Amazon warrior women to be nothing more than products of imagination, fictional characters created to serve as a backdrop for the greatness of Greek men. That arrogance was completely shattered by DNA analysis and modern forensic medicine. Archaeological teams carried their tools into the gigantic Kurgan burial mounds scattered across the Eurasian steppe, stretching from southern Russia all the way to the Altai Mountains. At the bottom of burial pits, several meters deep, they dragged a raw truth back into the light. The female skeletons found there had not been buried with looms, needle's thread, or delicate jewelry. They had been buried beneath the cold earth in the form of true killing machines. A series of female bodies from the nomadic Scythian tribes were excavated in full heavy war equipment. Experts used forceps to lift out bundles of razor-sharp bronze-tipped arrows, iron akanakis, fighting daggers fixed at the waist, and long steel-covered spears laid straight along the body. Forensic bone data immediately confirmed that these were not empty ceremonial grave goods. The flesh and bones of these women were filled with the brutal marks of close-quarters battle. Forensic doctors examined each section of bone and found bronze arrowheads buried deep, lodged firmly in the ribs and thigh bones of these female warriors. Many skulls carried cracked and split fractures across the top of the head, direct physical evidence of fatal blows from enemy battle axes. Their pelvises and thigh bones were clearly bent and deformed, confirming a life spent tightly bound to the backs of war horses from childhood. Countless healed fractures in the collarbones and arm bones exposed the violent clashes they had survived. The verdict of archaeology had been declared. The legend of the Amazon warrior women was a real historical entity of flesh and bone. They were the Scythian women. On the fiery prehistoric steppes, Scythian women never hid behind men. They put on armor themselves, mounted the fiercest war horses, charged directly into enemy formations, drew their bows to slaughter their enemies, bled and fell on the blood-soaked battlefield, just like the most ruthless warriors. Archaeology has uncovered the raw truth behind 15 legends. The ash layer of Troy, the sinkhole at Ubar, the catastrophe of the Great Flood, and the real wounds of the Amazon warrior women are all history. Our ancestors used these stories to record real disasters. History has always affirmed one law: moral decay inevitably leads to destruction. The wealthiest cities all collapsed when human beings sank into violence and sin. Sodom, Pompeii, and the prehistoric civilizations all paid the price with their very lives. But sadly, it seems that modern humanity today is once again repeating that same path of corruption. The dry bones beneath the earth demand that we immediately change the way we live. Human beings need to live truthfully, treat one another with kindness, and hold firmly to love for our fellow man. Practicing the teachings of God with sincerity will create a strong moral foundation. That is the only path for us to protect this civilization and preserve life for future generations. Thank you for watching this video all the way through. Please leave a like and subscribe to the channel to continue joining us as we excavate the historical truths still buried deep beneath the layers of the earth.